The eviction notice lay crumpled in Caleb Moore's calloused hand as his three daughters huddled behind him, their faces streaked with dust and fear. Lena Harper stood in the doorway of the sweltering cottage, watching the town's disapproval gather like storm clouds beyond the window. Judgment for marrying a poor widower, condemnation for choosing love over comfort, whispers that followed her like shadows through every sun-baked street. She had 90 days to prove them all wrong, 90 days before her family lost everything, 90 days to find hope in a valley that existed only in a dead man's letter. Welcome to a story of courage born from desperation, of hidden wealth discovered in the last place anyone thought to look, and of a woman who refused to let her family's future be written by the cruel ink of other people's opinions. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far Lena's journey travels. Now settle in, because this story begins where most would have given up entirely. The summer of 1887 had teeth. Not the gentle warmth of June mornings or the lazy heat of August afternoons, but the vicious, bone-dry heat of late July that turned soil to powder and patience to kindling. Lena Harper had learned this truth the hard way, standing in the center of Mineral Springs' only general store, while the temperature climbed and the silence around her grew heavier than the humidity pressing against the walls. She'd come for flour and cornmeal. Simple necessities, the kind of purchase that shouldn't draw attention, but nothing Lena did these days went unnoticed. "Mrs. Moore," the shopkeeper's voice carried across the store like a judgment already rendered. "That'll be $2.30. Lena counted out the coins slowly, aware of every eye tracking her movements. Mrs. Pemberton stood near the fabric table, fan moving in deliberate strokes. The banker's wife occupied the corner by the preserves, pretending to read labels she'd memorized months ago. Three younger women clustered near the door, their conversation suspended mid-sentence, all of them watching, all of them waiting. "Heard you took in washing last week," Mrs. Pemberton offered, her tone suggesting she'd heard considerably more than that. "How industrious." The word landed like a stone in still water. Lena tucked the flour into her basket, keeping her expression neutral. "Honest work's nothing to be ashamed of, Mrs. Pemberton." "Of course not, dear." The older woman's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Though I imagine your circumstances require rather more industriousness than most. 3 stepdaughters must be quite the burden." The temperature in the store seemed to climb another 10 degrees. "They're blessings, not burdens." Lena's voice remained steady, though heat crept up her neck that had nothing to do with July. "And Caleb works harder than any man I know." "I'm sure he does." The banker's wife finally looked up from her pretend inspection. "When he can find work, that is. These dry spells do make things difficult, especially for those without reserves." There it was, the real conversation beneath the polite words, the town's fascination with her choice to marry Caleb Moore, a widower who owned nothing but debt and determination, a man whose first wife had died leaving him with 3 daughters and a cottage that leaked in winter and baked in summer. A poor man, an unsuitable match, a decision that Mineral Springs had discussed, dissected, and deemed deeply disappointing. Lena had been 23 when she accepted his proposal, old enough to know her own mind, too old, by the town's estimation, to be choosy, but she'd chosen anyway, and they'd never forgiven her for it. "The Lord provides," Lena said simply, gathering her basket. "Indeed." Mrs. Pemberton's fan picked up speed, "though I've always believed the Lord helps those who help themselves to better judgment." Lena walked out into the brutal sunlight without responding. The heat hit her like a physical blow, pressing against her face and stealing the breath from her lungs. Main Street shimmered in the afternoon glare, dust devils dancing between the buildings. Even the horses at the hitching post looked miserable, heads low, tails switching at flies that had grown mean in the temperature. She made her way down the wooden sidewalk, boots clicking against the planks. The sound seemed too loud in the heavy air. Behind her, she could hear the store door open, voices spilling out. Poor thing. What did she expect? 3 children and a husband who can't provide? Lena kept walking. She'd learned early in her marriage that responding only fed the gossip. Better to move forward with dignity than to turn and fight battles that could never be won with words. The cottage stood at the edge of town, where the streets turned from packed earth to prairie grass. It had never been much. 2 rooms downstairs, a loft above where the girls slept in summer heat that made the space nearly unbearable. The roof needed patching, the windows stuck in their frames. The garden Lena had planted struggled in soil that had gone hard as clay. But it was theirs. Or it had been, until the rent collector came 3 days ago with papers that changed everything. Caleb sat on the front step when she arrived, his shoulders curved forward in a posture she'd come to recognize. Defeat had a particular shape, and her husband wore it more days than not. "They talking again?" he asked without looking up. Lena set down her basket. "They always talk. Doesn't make what they say true. Makes it hard to find work, though." He finally raised his head, and the exhaustion in his eyes went deeper than any summer heat could explain. "Bill Patterson told me straight out this morning. Said he'd like to hire me for the harvest crew, but his wife wouldn't hear of it. Apparently, I'm not the kind of man he should associate with." "Since when does Patterson listen to his wife about field work?" "Since his wife plays cards with Mrs. Pemberton." Caleb's laugh held no humor. "It's all connected, Lena. The whole damn town's connected, and we're on the outside looking in." She sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. The porch boards radiated stored heat through her skirt. "We've managed before." "Not like this." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket, the creases worn soft from repeated handling. 90 days, Lena. That's what this says. 90 days to come up with 6 months back rent, plus what we owe going forward, or we're out. And summer work's drying up faster than the creek bed. Nobody wants to hire the poor fool who married above his station and dragged a decent woman down with him. "You didn't drag me anywhere. I chose this." "You chose wrong." The words came out flat, factual. "Your mother tried to tell you. Hell, half the town tried to tell you. Lena Harper could have had her pick. The banker's nephew, the cattle broker from Silver City, that lawyer who came through 2 years back. But you picked me instead, a widower with 3 daughters and nothing else to offer." Inside the cottage, something clattered. Footsteps crossed the floor above them, quick and light. The girls were home from their afternoon chores, probably arguing about whose turn it was to fetch water. Mary was 10 now, all sharp elbows and sharper questions. Grace had just turned 8, quiet and watchful. Little Ruth was 5, still young enough to believe that loving something made it permanent. "I picked you," Lena said quietly, "because when I looked at you, I saw a man who knew what mattered. Those girls in there? They matter. The way you work yourself to the bone for them? That matters. The fact that you loved your first wife enough to honor her memory by caring for what you built together? That matters more than all the bankers' nephews and cattle brokers in the territory." Caleb turned to look at her, and something in his expression cracked. "Pretty words don't pay rent, Lena." "No, but they remind us why we're fighting." She took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "We've got 90 days. That's not nothing. We've got time to figure this out." "Time to do what?" "I've asked every rancher within 20 miles for work. Nobody's hiring. The drought's got everyone nervous, holding on to cash. And even if someone was hiring, they'd pick anyone else before they'd pick me." The door creaked open behind them. Mary stood in the opening, her dark hair escaping its braid, her expression too old for 10 years. "Papa? We're out of water again, and Grace says there's a hole in the roof above our bed. It's dripping something." Caleb closed his eyes briefly. "I'll fix it." "When?" Mary's bluntness was one of her defining characteristics. She'd learned early that soft words didn't change hard facts. "You said that about the step last month, and Ruth almost broke her ankle on it yesterday." "Mary," Lena's voice carried a gentle warning, "your father's doing his best." "His best isn't enough." The girl didn't say it cruelly, just truthfully. "Nothing he does is enough. Not for the town, not for the landlord, not for Rob. That's enough." Caleb stood abruptly, the eviction notice still clutched in his hand. "Go help your sisters. I'll get water before supper." Mary disappeared back inside without argument. She'd said what she needed to say. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Lena rose, brushing dust from her skirt. Through the window, she could see Grace and Ruth in the main room, heads bent together over something. A book, probably. Grace had taught herself to read from the old Bible left by their mother, and now she read to Ruth every evening, both of them pretending they weren't hungry, weren't hot, Weren't scared. I'm going to walk out to the property line, Caleb said suddenly. Check if any of the fence posts are worth salvaging. Might be able to sell them for lumber. It's too hot for that work. It's too hot for everything. He stepped off the porch, then paused. Your mother came by this morning while you were in town. Lena's stomach tightened. What did she want? To offer you a way out. He didn't turn around. Said her cousin in Sacramento is looking for a housekeeper. Good wages, respectable position, room and board included. She's got it all arranged. You could leave next week. The summer air felt suddenly thinner. She said that in front of you? Said it was the Christian thing to do, giving you an escape from the mistake you made. Now he did turn, and his face was carefully blank. I told her to leave, but she's right, Lena. You could go. Take a real job, build a real life. You don't have to go down with this ship. Lena walked down the steps until she stood directly in front of him. The heat rising from the packed earth blurred the air between them. I made vows, Caleb, for better or worse. This might be worse, but it's still the life I chose. I'm not leaving. Even if we lose everything, we haven't lost everything. We've lost some money and some comfort and the good opinion of people whose opinions shouldn't matter. She reached up, touching his face. But we haven't lost each other. We haven't lost those girls. And as long as we've got that, we've got enough to build from. He leaned into her hand, eyes closing. I don't know how to fix this, Lena. I don't know how to give you what you deserve. Then stop trying to give me what I deserve and start figuring out what we need. Those are different things. For a long moment, they stood there in the brutal heat, held together by something stronger than comfort or security. Then Caleb straightened, kissed her forehead, and headed toward the fence line without another word. Lena watched him go, then turned back to the cottage. Inside, the girls had abandoned their book and started preparing vegetables for supper. Potatoes and carrots from the struggling garden, stretched thin with water and hope. They worked in synchronized silence, a rhythm born from months of making do. Is Papa angry? Ruth asked, not looking up from her peeling. Papa's worried, Lena corrected, taking up a knife to help. There's a difference. Mrs. Pemberton says worry is just anger without courage. Grace's voice was soft, but her hands moved efficiently through the work. I heard her telling Mama Whitfield that Papa's let his worries make him weak. Lena's knife paused mid-cut. Mrs. Pemberton doesn't know your Papa. She doesn't know what strength looks like when it's carrying a heavy load. Are we the heavy load? Mary's directness cut through pretense. Is that why everyone treats us different now? Because we make Papa look weak? You make your Papa look like exactly what he is. A man who honors his responsibilities and loves his daughters. Lena resumed cutting, her movements precise. And anyone who can't see that isn't worth worrying about. But we do have to worry, Mary insisted. I heard you and Papa talking last night about the rent, about leaving. Ruth's hands stilled. We're leaving. No. Lena's voice carried absolute certainty. We're not leaving. We're figuring things out, which is different. How? Grace asked, her quiet intensity demanding real answers. How do we figure it out when nobody will hire Papa and we're running out of time? It was the same question that had kept Lena awake for 3 nights running. The same question that turned her stomach whenever she counted their remaining coins. The same question that made the summer heat feel less like weather and more like judgment. I don't know yet, she admitted, and the honesty felt both frightening and necessary. But I know we don't give up, and I know we don't let other people's opinions decide what we're capable of. They finished preparing supper in silence. Outside, the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of copper and rust. The heat didn't break. It never broke in July, but it shifted, becoming marginally more bearable. Caleb returned as dusk settled, carrying 2 fence posts and an expression of grim satisfaction. Millers agreed to buy these for 50 cents each. It's not much, but it's something. They ate at the small table that took up most of the main room, portions carefully measured to stretch until tomorrow. The potatoes had come out mushy, the carrots slightly tough, but nobody complained. They'd learned to be grateful for full bellies, regardless of quality. After supper, while the girls cleaned dishes, Caleb pulled Lena outside to the porch. The evening had brought some relief from the heat, though the air still felt thick enough to chew. "I've been thinking," he said, lowering his voice, "about what you said, about figuring out what we need versus what I think you deserve." "And?" He reached into his shirt pocket, pulling out an envelope that had gone soft with age. The paper was yellowed, the writing faded. "My father gave me this 20 years ago, right before he died. I was 16, barely old enough to understand what he was saying." Lena took the envelope carefully. "What is it?" "Directions. To a piece of land he claimed but never registered. Said he'd found it during the war when he was running from a Confederate patrol. Hid in a valley, so well protected by hills that the soldiers rode right past without knowing it was there." Caleb's voice carried a strange mixture of hope and hesitation. "He said there was water there, trees, soil that grew things even in drought years. But he never went back. Got married, settled here, built a life. Always meant to return, but time got away from him." "Why are you showing me this now?" "Because when he gave it to me, he said it was for desperate times, for when everything else had failed and I needed a place to start over." He met her eyes in the gathering darkness. "Lena, we're in desperate times. I've tried everything else. Maybe it's time to try something that sounds impossible." She looked down at the envelope, at the faded writing that might hold directions to nowhere, or might hold directions to salvation. "How far?" 3 days' ride, according to his notes. Northeast, into the hills past Silver Creek. Territory nobody goes to anymore because it's too remote, too hard to reach. He paused. "Could be nothing there. Could be exactly what he described. Either way, if we're going to lose everything here, maybe we should lose it trying to find something better." Inside, the girls' voices rose in their nightly ritual, Grace reading, Ruth asking questions, Mary offering commentary. The sound drifted through the open window like smoke, fragile and precious. "We take them with us," Lena said. "If we go, we all go. It'll be hard travel. Summer heat, rough terrain, no guarantees. Harder than watching them lose their home. Harder than teaching them that giving up is easier than fighting." She handed back the envelope. "Besides, I didn't marry you for guarantees. I married you because you're the kind of man who keeps 20-year-old directions to impossible valleys, just in case." Caleb's laugh was startled and genuine. "You're either very brave or very foolish. Can I be both?" She smiled in the darkness. "When do we leave?" "Soon as I can sell the fence posts and buy supplies. 3 days, maybe 4. He tucked the envelope away. "Lena, you understand what we're risking. If there's nothing there, if my father was wrong or lying or just confused, then we'll come back and face what we have to face. But at least we'll have tried." She stood, brushing off her skirt. "Besides, seems to me we've already lost the town's good opinion. Might as well lose it doing something worth talking about." The next morning arrived with the same brutal heat, but something had shifted. Caleb moved with new purpose, selling the fence posts and purchasing supplies with careful deliberation. Lena packed their belongings into neat bundles, choosing function over sentiment. The girls watched with wide eyes, asking questions that sometimes had answers and sometimes didn't. "Where are we going?" Ruth wanted to know. "To find a place your grandfather discovered," Lena explained, folding their few spare clothes. "A valley where things grow even when everywhere else is dry." "Is it real?" Mary's skepticism was predictable. "We're going to find out." They told no one. Not the landlord, not the neighbors, not the town that had spent months discussing their failures. 3 days before the week was out, Caleb loaded their wagon in the pre-dawn darkness, while Lena made sure the girls were dressed and ready. The cottage stood empty as they pulled away, its windows dark, its roof still leaking. Someone else's problem now. Someone else's burden. They headed northeast as the sun rose, turning the sky from black to gray to gold. Behind them, Mineral Springs continued its morning routine, unaware that the couple it had judged so harshly had chosen a different verdict entirely. The road deteriorated quickly once they left the main routes. Caleb followed landmarks from his father's directions. A lightning-struck oak, a creek that ran backwards in spring floods, a rock formation that looked like a sleeping bear. Each mile took them further from everything familiar, deeper into territory where maps grew vague and certainty became luxury. By noon of the first day, the heat had become a living thing, pressing down on them with malicious intent. The girls huddled in the wagon bed beneath a canvas tarp, trying to stay cool. Lena drove while Caleb walked ahead, checking the path, making sure they hadn't missed a turn. "Mama Lena?" Grace's voice was small beneath the tarp. "What if we don't find it?" "Then we'll find something else," Lena answered, keeping her eyes on the horizon. "But we don't quit looking just because it's hard." The first day bled into the second. They made camp in the shadow of hills that offered some relief from the sun. Caleb rationed water carefully, measuring each sip. The girls fell asleep quickly, exhausted by heat and uncertainty. "Still think this was the right choice?" Caleb asked, sitting beside Lena as stars emerged overhead. She leaned against his shoulder, too tired for elaborate words. "Ask me when we get there." "And if we don't get there?" "Then ask me when we're somewhere else." She closed her eyes. "But we're not going back, Caleb. Whatever happens, we're not going back to people who made us feel small for trying to be something more." The second day brought them to terrain that matched the directions more precisely. Hills that rose like walls on either side, a pass so narrow the wagon barely fit through. The temperature climbed even higher, trapped between rock faces that radiated stored heat. But there was something else, too. A change in the air. A hint of moisture that didn't belong in July drought. On the morning of the third day, Caleb stopped the wagon at the base of a final ridge. According to his father's notes, what they sought lay just beyond. "Wait here," he told Lena. "Let me check first." We checked together. She climbed down, then helped the girls out of the wagon bed. "Whatever's up there, we see it as a family." They climbed the ridge in the early morning coolness, before the sun had fully established its dominance. The hill was steeper than it looked, forcing them to scramble over loose rock and scrub brush. Mary led the way with determined efficiency. Grace helped Ruth navigate the difficult sections. Caleb and Lena brought up the rear, hands linked, breaths coming hard. At the top, they stopped. Below them spread a valley that shouldn't have existed, green where everything else was brown, lush where drought had taken hold. A river cut through the center, glinting silver in the morning light, fed by springs that rose from the hillsides. Trees, actual trees, not the stunted scrub that passed for timber in the territory, grew in groves along the water. Grass, thick and tall, moved in waves across slopes that looked fertile enough to grow anything. And in the center of it all, tucked against the northern hillside where afternoon shade would provide relief from summer heat, stood a cabin. Sturdy logs, solid construction, a chimney that rose straight and true. "Papa," Mary whispered, "is that real?" Caleb pulled out the directions, reading them for the 100th time. Then he looked up, comparing what was written to what lay before them. "It's real," he said, and his voice cracked on the words. "It's all real." They descended into the valley in silence, each step feeling like crossing from one world into another. The temperature dropped as they walked, cooled by water and shade, and the mysterious protection of hills that seemed to hold back the worst of summer's fury. The grass brushed against their legs, green and alive. The river sang over stones. The cabin, when they reached it, proved even more substantial than it had appeared from above. Someone had built it to last. Thick walls, a sound roof, windows with real glass. The door hung slightly open, revealing darkness within. Caleb pushed it wide, and they stepped inside. The interior was dim and dusty, but intact. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A loft above would sleep the girls. The main room was large enough for living, and a smaller room off the back would serve for privacy. Furniture remained, a table, chairs, a bed frame. All well made, all waiting. "Who built this?" Lena asked, running her hand along the table's surface. "My father, I think. Or whoever found it before him." Caleb moved to the window, looking out at the valley. "He said in the directions that he'd prepared it, made it ready for when he could return. I always thought he was just dreaming, planning something that would never happen. But he did this." Mary stood in the center of the room, turning slowly. "He made it ready. For us." Ruth found the loft ladder and climbed it before anyone could stop her. Her delighted gasp drifted down. "There's beds up here, real beds with ropes for mattresses." "Careful," Lena called, but her heart wasn't in the warning. She was too busy trying to understand what they'd found: a valley that protected itself from drought, a cabin built by hands that had believed in impossible futures, land that no one had claimed because no one knew it existed. Grace joined her sister in the loft while Mary investigated the fireplace. Caleb stood at the window, shoulders shaking slightly. When Lena joined him, she saw tears on his face. "I didn't believe," he said quietly. "When I showed you those directions, I didn't actually believe we'd find this. I thought maybe we'd find the valley, maybe some sign that it had existed once, but this—" He gestured at everything around them. "This is hope I didn't know I was carrying." Lena wrapped her arms around him from behind, resting her cheek against his back. "Then maybe that's what we were really looking for. Not just land or a cabin, but permission to hope again." They spent the rest of that day exploring. The valley revealed itself slowly, fruit trees gone wild but still bearing, a garden plot that only needed clearing, a spring house built into the hillside where water ran cold even in July heat. And beyond the cabin, tucked into a fold of the northern hill where morning sun would hit it first, they found something that stopped Caleb in his tracks. A silver vein running through exposed rock like a promise. Not rich enough to draw prospectors or mining companies. Not obvious enough to have been spotted by the few hunters who might have passed through the area. But real. Valuable. Enough to change everything, if worked carefully. "We don't tell anyone," Caleb said, his voice hard with sudden certainty. "Not about the silver. Maybe not about any of this. We work it ourselves, take out only what we need, use it to build something that lasts." "And the town?" Lena asked. "They'll wonder what happened to us." "Let them wonder." He turned to face her, and his expression held something she hadn't seen in months. Not just hope, but determination. "We came out here because we had nothing left to lose. Turns out we had everything left to find. I'm not giving anyone the chance to take it from us again." That evening, they made camp outside the cabin, building a fire with fallen wood that burned clean and hot. The girls played by the river until dusk, splashing in water that ran clear and cold. Lena prepared a simple meal from their dwindling supplies, already planning what they'd plant in the garden, what they'd harvest from the fruit trees, how they'd make this valley not just a refuge but a home. As stars emerged overhead, different stars than the ones above Mineral Springs, Caleb pulled out the eviction notice one final time. He held it in the firelight, reading the words that had driven them here. Then he fed it to the flames. 90 days, he said, watching the paper curl and blacken. "We had 90 days to figure it out. Took us 3 to find what mattered." Mary leaned against Lena's shoulder. Grace held Ruth in her lap, and they sat together as the last light faded from the sky. Somewhere behind them, over the hills and across miles of drought-stricken territory, Mineral Springs continued its evening routines. Mrs. Pemberton probably sat on her porch, fanning herself and discussing the scandalous disappearance of the Moore family. The banker's wife likely speculated about debts left unpaid. The town would talk and judge and move on to the next source of entertainment. But here, in a valley that existed outside the boundaries of maps and gossip, the Moore family sat in silence that felt like peace. The summer heat that had been an enemy became merely weather. The judgment that had weighed them down became irrelevant noise. Ruth fell asleep first, her breathing soft and even. Grace followed soon after, still holding her youngest sister. Mary fought sleep until the end, but finally surrendered, her head heavy against Lena's arm. "We should get them inside," Lena whispered. "In a minute." Caleb stared into the dying fire. "I just want to sit here a little longer. Remember what it feels like to have found something instead of lost it." So they sat, husband and wife, while their daughters slept and the valley breathed around them in the darkness. The river sang its endless song. The wind moved through grass that grew thick and green. The hills stood guard against whatever judgment or hardship might come looking. And in the morning, Lena knew they would begin the real work, cleaning the cabin, planting the garden, planning for harvests and winters, and the slow, steady building of a life that belonged to no one's expectations but their own. But tonight, they simply existed in the space between desperation and hope, between what they'd left behind and what they'd finally found. The summer that had tried to burn them down to nothing had instead driven them towards something more valuable than comfort or security. It had driven them toward each other, toward the truth that real wealth wasn't measured in coins or approval, but in moments like this, quiet, complete, and entirely their own. The first full day in the valley began before dawn, when the world existed in shades of gray and the air held a coolness that would vanish within hours. Lena woke to find Caleb already gone from their makeshift bed on the cabin floor, his absence marked by the blanket folded neatly where he'd slept. Through the window, she could see him standing by the river, silhouetted against the gradually lightening sky. She rose quietly, careful not to wake the girls still sleeping in the loft above. Outside, her feet found the path to the water through instinct more than sight. The grass was wet with dew, soaking through her skirt hem, cold enough to raise goosebumps on her ankles. Caleb didn't turn when she approached, but his hand reached out, finding hers without looking. "Couldn't sleep," he said softly. "Kept thinking this would disappear if I closed my eyes too long." "It's still here." Lena squeezed his fingers. "All of it. I've been walking the perimeter since first light. The valley's bigger than it looked from the ridge. Maybe 300 acres, all told. The river runs year-round according to the watermarks on the rocks. And Lena—" He finally looked at her, his face barely visible in the pre-dawn light. "There's more silver, not just the one vein. I found 2 others, smaller but real. My father must have known. Must have spent time here mapping it all out." "We'll work it carefully," she said, though her heart raced at the implications. "Take only what we need." "What we need might be more than we think." He gestured toward the cabin. "Roof needs work before winter. We'll need tools, seed for planting, supplies we can't make ourselves. And the girls, Mary should be in school, Grace needs books. Ruth deserves more than hand-me-downs 3 times over." "One thing at a time." Lena turned him to face her fully. "First we make this place livable. Then we figure out the rest." The sun broke over the eastern hills as they walked back toward the cabin, painting everything in shades of gold and rose. The girls were awake when they entered, Ruth hanging over the loft edge watching them with sleep-mussed hair and wide eyes. "Is it still real?" the 5-year-old asked, her voice carrying the uncertainty of someone who'd been disappointed before. "Still real," Caleb confirmed, reaching up to lift her down. "And we've got work to do to make it feel like home." They spent the morning taking inventory. The cabin had been abandoned but not neglected. Whoever had left it had done so with the intention of returning. The furniture was solid, built from local timber and joined with care. A cast-iron stove sat in one corner, dusty but intact. Shelves lined one wall, empty now but ready for filling. The loft held 4 bed frames, their rope supports sagging but repairable. Mary found a trunk beneath one of the beds, its contents protected by oilcloth wrapping. Inside were tools: a hammer, nails, a saw with teeth that still held their edge, chisels and planes, and a hand drill. At the bottom, wrapped separately, they found a leather journal filled with cramped handwriting. Caleb opened it carefully, and Lena watched his face change as he read. "It's my father's," he said, his voice rough. "His records. He came here 7 times over 3 years, always planning to bring us, always finding reasons to wait. The last entry is dated 1867, 2 months before he died." "What does it say?" Grace asked, standing on tiptoe to see. Caleb cleared his throat. "To whoever finds this, I built this place for my son, but time ran out before I could give it to him proper. The valley provides if you're willing to work for it. The silver will give you a start, but don't let it consume you. Real wealth is in the soil and water, in what grows and what endures. Build well, live better. And remember that sometimes the best inheritance is the one that comes when you need it most, not when you expect it." The silence that followed felt sacred. Ruth pressed against Lena's side. Grace stood very still, and Mary's usual sharp skepticism softened into something more complicated. "He knew," Mary said finally. "He knew we'd be desperate when we found this." "He hoped we'd be smart enough to look," Caleb corrected, closing the journal with care. "There's a difference." They worked through the heat of the day, each taking tasks according to ability. Caleb climbed to inspect the roof, finding it better than expected but still needing patches. Lena and the girls swept years of dust from the cabin's interior, scrubbed the windows until they gleamed, and beat the mattress ticking outside until their arms ached. The spring house yielded treasures, clay crocks for storing food, a butter churn, mason jars by the dozen, waiting to be filled. By afternoon, when the temperature climbed toward unbearable, they retreated to the river. The girls stripped to their chemises and splashed in the shallows, while Lena washed their travel-stained clothes on the smooth rocks. Caleb worked nearby, repairing the worst of the roof damage with materials he'd found in a lean-to behind the cabin. "Papa," Grace called from the water, "there's fish in here, big ones." "Then we'll eat well tonight," he called back, and the normalcy of the exchange felt precious. No worry about whether they could afford the meal, no calculation of how long supplies would last, just the simple certainty that the valley would provide. That evening, Caleb showed Mary how to set a line for fish while Grace and Ruth gathered wild greens that grew along the riverbank. Lena explored the fruit trees, finding them heavy with plums and early apples, slightly smaller than cultivated varieties but abundant. She filled her apron with fruit, already planning preserves and pies, already thinking in terms of seasons and harvests rather than days and desperation. Dinner that night was fish cooked over an open fire, wild greens boiled with salt, and plums so ripe they burst with sweetness. They ate until they were full, genuinely full, not just no longer hungry, and the luxury of it brought tears to Lena's eyes that she blinked away quickly. "Tomorrow," Caleb said as they cleaned up, "I'll ride back toward civilization. Not to Mineral Springs, but to Silver City. Sell some of the silver, buy what we need, seeds, proper tools, maybe some chickens if I can transport them." "How long will you be gone?" Ruth's voice was small, frightened. 3 days, maybe 4. He crouched to her level. "But I'm coming back. This is home now. I'm just getting supplies to make it better." "I don't want you to go." The tears she'd been holding spilled over. "What if you don't come back? What if something happens?" Caleb pulled her close, and over her head, his eyes met Lena's. They both knew what the fear really was. Not that he wouldn't return, but that good things never lasted, that security was always temporary, that happiness was a trick that ended in pain. "Listen to me, Ruth." He pulled back enough to see her face. "I made it through a war. I made it through losing your mama. I made it through the hardest year of my life in that town that couldn't see past its own judgment. You think I'm going to let a 3-day ride keep me from coming back to this? To you girls and Mama Lena and this valley?" "Promise?" Ruth whispered. "I promise." He said it like an oath. "And when I come back, I'll bring sugar for Mama Lena to make those plum preserves and paper for Grace to write on, and maybe some ribbon for your hair if the store in Silver City is fancy enough." Mary, listening from her position by the fire, spoke up. "And what will you bring for yourself, Papa?" The question seemed to surprise him. "Don't need anything for myself. That's not what I asked." Mary's directness cut through sentiment. "What do you want? Not what we need, not what's practical. What would make you happy?" Caleb looked around at the cabin glowing in the firelight, at his daughters watching him with varying degrees of understanding, at Lena standing near enough to touch. "I'm looking at it," he said simply. "Everything I want is right here." Later, after the girls had gone to bed and the fire had burned down to embers, Lena and Caleb sat on the cabin steps watching stars emerge in a sky unmarred by town lights or smoke. The valley settled into night around them with sounds they were still learning. Owls calling from the trees, the river's constant song, wind moving through grass with a whisper like secrets being shared. "Are you scared?" Lena asked quietly. "About going back toward the world?" "Terrified," he admitted. "Not of the trip itself, but of what it means. Once I sell that silver, once we start buying supplies, we're declaring ourselves, saying we found something worth protecting. And people who have things worth protecting become targets. Then we don't tell anyone where we are. You sell the silver as a prospector passing through, buy your supplies, and come home. No one needs to know about this valley. And when the girls get older, when they want to go to town dances or court young men or have lives beyond these hills," his voice carried a weight she recognized, the burden of thinking too far ahead. "Then we deal with that when it comes." Lena leaned her head on his shoulder. "But right now, they're young enough to be happy here, and we're lucky enough to have found a place where happy is possible. Let's not borrow tomorrow's problems when today's solutions are still settling in." He pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her hair. "When did you get so wise?" "Probably around the same time you got brave enough to follow a dead man's directions into the hills." She smiled against his shoulder. We make a good team, Caleb Moore. The town didn't think so. The town was wrong about a lot of things. She straightened, turning to face him. They were wrong about you being weak. Wrong about me being foolish. Wrong about those girls being burdens. And they'll never know how wrong they were, because we're not going back to prove anything to them. You don't want them to know? Don't want to show up in a new dress with money in the bank and watch their faces change? The temptation was real. Lena could taste it, bitter and sweet at once. The fantasy of returning to Mineral Springs transformed, of watching Mrs. Pemberton's fan still in shock, of seeing the banker's wife stumble over apologies. But beneath the fantasy lay a truth she'd learned over the past months. Revenge is just another way of letting them matter, she said slowly. And I'm done letting them matter. Let them think we failed. Let them tell stories about the poor fool who took his family into the hills and disappeared. We know the truth. That's enough. Caleb studied her face in the starlight, and whatever he saw there made him smile. I love you, Lena Harper Moore. I love you too. She kissed him softly. Now go to bed. You've got a long trip ahead, and I need you rested enough to make it back to us. He left before dawn 2 days later, the wagon loaded with carefully selected silver ore disguised beneath a layer of scrap metal and old tools. Lena watched him go from the cabin porch, Ruth pressed against her side, Grace and Mary standing slightly apart with identical expressions of worry poorly concealed. He'll be fine, Lena said, as much to herself as to them. Your papa knows how to take care of himself.
Mama Lena?
Grace's voice was careful, feeling out uncertain ground. Do you think he'll really come back? The question cut deeper than it should have, revealing fears that ran beneath the surface like underground rivers. Not just fear about this trip, but about permanence and trust, and whether good things ever really lasted. Lena knelt down, gathering all three girls close enough to look them in the eyes. Your papa came back from war when plenty of men didn't. He came back to you girls after your mother died, when he could have sent you to relatives and started over. He came back to me every evening during the worst months in Mineral Springs, when leaving would have been easier than staying. Coming back is what he does. It's who he is. But what if, Ruth started. No what ifs, Lena interrupted gently. We don't live in what if. We live in what is. And what is right now is that we have work to do. That garden won't plant itself, and those plums won't preserve themselves, and this cabin won't become a proper home just by wishing, so we can sit here worrying, or we can get busy building something your papa will be proud to come back to. Mary nodded slowly, her practical nature responding to the logic. The garden first. Grace, you and Ruth can help me mark out rows. Mama Lena, you should check the spring house. I think there's more storage space than we realized. They worked through Caleb's absence with determined focus, turning worry into productivity. The garden plot behind the cabin had gone wild, but beneath the weeds they found rich soil that crumbled dark and promising in their hands. They marked rows with string and stakes, cleared rocks to build a border wall, and turned the earth until their backs ached and their hands blistered. Lena tackled the spring house, finding it bigger than expected and cleverly designed. The cold water from the hillside spring ran through a channel in the floor, keeping the temperature stable even in summer heat. Shelves lined the walls, and there was space for a work table where she could prepare foods for storage. Someone, probably Caleb's father, had built this with the understanding that survival in isolation required proper preservation. On the second evening without Caleb, as they sat down to a simple supper of cornbread and wild greens, Grace asked the question that had been building. What happens if someone else finds this place? What if they try to claim it? Then we prove it's ours, Mary answered before Lena could speak. Papa's father built that cabin. That makes it ours by right. But we don't have papers, Grace persisted. No deed, no official claim. Anyone could say they got here first. Lena set down her fork, considering. The legal reality was complex. Land this remote might not even be properly surveyed, might exist in the gaps between official maps. But possession was more than paperwork. It was presence, improvement, the visible investment of labor and love. We make it undeniably ours, she said finally. We plant crops with our hands, raise buildings with our sweat, build a life so clearly established that no one can question our right to be here. And we keep it quiet. Don't tell people where we are, don't invite attention, just live well and let the valley protect itself. Like a secret, Ruth said, her eyes wide. A secret valley that nobody knows about but us. Exactly like that. Lena smiled at her youngest. And the best way to keep a secret is to make sure nobody's looking for it in the first place. The third day stretched long and anxious. Lena found herself watching the ridge where they'd first descended, looking for movement that didn't come. The girls grew quiet, their earlier industry fading into distraction. Even Mary's practical focus wavered, her attention drifting toward the valley entrance more frequently as afternoon wore into evening. They made camp outside as the sun set, building a fire more for comfort than warmth. The night sounds of the valley surrounded them, familiar now but still strange, still carrying the weight of newness. Lena held Ruth in her lap, while Grace leaned against her shoulder and Mary poked at the fire with elaborate casualness. "Tell us about when you met Papa," Ruth requested, her voice sleepy but determined. "The real story, not the one you tell at church." Lena laughed softly. "There wasn't much to tell at church. We met, we courted briefly, we married. Very proper, very boring." "But what really happened?" Grace pressed. "Why did you choose him when everyone said you shouldn't?" The question deserved honesty. These girls were old enough to understand that love was more complicated than fairy tales suggested, that choosing a partner meant choosing a life, and that sometimes the right choice looked wrong from the outside. "I chose him," Lena said slowly, "because he was the only man who looked at me like I was enough. Not too old for marriage, not too plain, not too opinionated, just enough, exactly as I was. And when he talked about you girls, he didn't talk about the burden or the responsibility. He talked about the privilege of being your papa." "But you knew we came with him," Mary said. "You knew marrying him meant taking us on." "I did. And I also knew that any man who loved his daughters that fiercely would be a man worth loving. Turned out I was right." She kissed the top of Ruth's head. "You three are the best part of choosing him. You make it all worthwhile." "Even when the town talked?" Grace asked quietly. "Especially then." Lena's voice firmed with conviction. "Because their talk proved they didn't understand what mattered. They saw 3 children as a burden. I saw 3 chances to love and be loved. They saw poverty. I saw potential. They saw a mistake. I saw the rest of my life starting exactly right." Mary's poker stilled in her hand. "Do you ever regret it? Be honest." Lena looked at each of them in turn, Mary with her fierce independence and protective instincts, Grace with her quiet depth and careful observations, Ruth with her open heart and innocent faith. Then she looked around at the valley, holding them safe, at the cabin waiting in the darkness, at the life they were building from determination and hope. "Not once," she said firmly, "not even during the worst of it. Your papa and I made a choice together. We chose each other, we chose you girls, and we chose to believe that love and work could build something better than comfort without purpose. This valley just proved we were right all along." They slept outside that night, too restless to retreat to the cabin. Lena woke several times, checking the sky, listening for sounds that might signal Caleb's return. But the night remained quiet except for natural sounds, and dawn came with no sign of the wagon. The 4th day began with a tension that infected everything. Breakfast was eaten in near silence. Chores were completed mechanically. Even Ruth's usual chatter dried up, replaced by worried glances toward the ridge. By midday, Lena had to fight down her own rising panic. 4 days, he'd said. Maybe 5 if things went poorly. But what if something had gone wrong? What if someone had recognized him despite his precautions? What if the silver had drawn attention he couldn't deflect? What if he'd been hurt on the road, thrown from the wagon, attacked by bandits or wild animals? She was standing by the river, hands shaking too much to continue washing vegetables, when Mary appeared beside her. "He's coming back," the girl said with absolute certainty. "You said so yourself. Coming back is what he does." "I know." "Then stop worrying and trust it." Mary picked up the vegetables Lena had dropped. "He wouldn't leave us, not after everything." The simple faith in those words steadied something in Lena's chest. Mary was right. Caleb had proven himself too many times to doubt him now. Whatever delayed his return, it wasn't abandonment or failure. It was just life being complicated, the way life always was. She was about to respond when Ruth's shriek split the air. "He's here! Papa's here! They all ran, scrambling over the uneven ground toward the ridge. And there, silhouetted against the afternoon sky, was the wagon. Slower than before, riding lower, clearly weighted with cargo. And driving it, solid and real and safe, was Caleb. He saw them coming and stopped the wagon, climbing down to meet their rush. Ruth got there first, launching herself at him with enough force to stagger him backward. Grace and Mary followed more decorously but with equal intensity. And Lena, bringing up the rear, simply walked into his arms and held on. 4 days, she said against his chest. You said 3, maybe 4. Took longer to sell the silver than I expected. His voice rumbled in her ear. Had to be careful, make sure nobody got suspicious. But I got good prices, and the supplies are all here. Everything we need and then some. They unloaded the wagon as the sun began its descent, revealing Caleb's success. Seed for planting, corn, wheat, beans, squash, turnips, tools, proper shovels and hoes, a scythe for harvesting, a pickaxe for the silver, canvas for patching the wagon cover, nails and rope, chickens, 6 of them, clucking irritably in a crate, a milk cow, gentle-eyed and patient, tied behind the wagon, and for the girls, small luxuries that made them gasp, sugar and flour and real coffee, ribbons and paper and pencils, a storybook with colored pictures. You bought too much, Lena protested, even as she marveled at the bounty. I bought exactly enough. Caleb pulled out the leather pouch that held their remaining money and pressed it into her hands. It was heavier than it should have been. The silver brought more than I hoped, and I was careful. Told people I was a prospector heading west, that I'd struck a small vein and wanted to outfit properly before winter. Nobody questioned it. Nobody followed. You're certain? I'm certain. He cupped her face in his hands. We're safe, Lena. For the first time in longer than I can remember, we're actually safe. That night they feasted. Lena made biscuits with the new flour, fried salt pork Caleb had purchased, and served the plums she'd been saving. The girls ate until they were stuffed, and for the first time since arriving in the valley, laughter came easily. Real laughter, not the careful kind that feared interruption. After supper, while Caleb settled the cow and chickens in the lean-to he'd reinforced earlier, Lena found the storybook and opened it with Grace and Ruth pressed close on either side. Mary joined them after a moment's pretense of being too old for such things, and they read together by lamplight, a luxury they could afford now with proper oil instead of tallow candles. The story was about a girl who found a secret garden, and the parallels weren't lost on any of them. But whereas the book's garden was hidden behind walls and locked gates, theirs was protected by distance and obscurity. No walls needed when nobody knew to look. When the story ended, Ruth yawned widely. Are we staying here forever, Mama Lena? As long as forever lasts, Lena answered, closing the book. What does that mean? It means we're home. She looked up to find Caleb standing in the doorway, backlit by the last light of day. And home is where we choose to be, not where circumstances force us. That night, lying beside Caleb in the cabin's main room, while the girls slept soundly above, Lena listened to the valley settling into darkness. The cow lowed softly from the lean-to. The chickens made small, contented noises. The river sang its endless song. And beside her, Caleb breathed deep and even, the tension that had defined him for months finally, blessedly absent. She thought about the eviction notice burning in the fire days ago, about the town they'd left behind with its judgment and small horizons, about the desperate climb up that ridge, not knowing what they'd find beyond it, about standing at the top and seeing green where there should have been brown, possibility where there should have been ending. Thank you, she whispered, though she wasn't entirely sure who she was thanking. Caleb's father for his foresight, the valley for existing, fate or providence or simple luck for leading them here when they needed it most. Caleb stirred beside her, not quite awake. Nothing. She pressed a kiss to his shoulder. Just grateful. Me too, he mumbled, already falling back asleep. Me too. And in the darkness, surrounded by everything they'd found and everyone they loved, Lena finally let herself believe it. They were safe. They were home. And tomorrow would bring not desperation, but simply the next day's work in a place that welcomed their efforts, instead of judging their struggles. The summer heat that had driven them here would peak and pass. Autumn would come with harvest and preparation. Winter would test them, but they'd be ready. And spring would bring new growth, new possibilities, new confirmation that what they'd built was real and lasting. But all of that was tomorrow. Tonight, they simply rested in the present, in the miracle of having found not just land or silver or shelter, but the chance to build a life on their own terms, away from voices that had never understood what they were capable of becoming. The weeks that followed Caleb's return fell into a rhythm that felt both foreign and essential. Lena woke each morning to birdsong instead of the clatter of town wagons, to fresh air instead of dust and judgment. The girls adapted with the resilience of youth, their initial wariness giving way to genuine contentment as the valley proved itself day after day. By the end of the first month, the garden had taken root. Corn pushed through the dark soil in neat rows. Beans climbed the poles Caleb had constructed. Squash vines sprawled across the ground with aggressive enthusiasm. The chickens laid eggs with reliable generosity, and the cow provided milk that Lena churned into butter richer than anything she'd tasted in town. They were eating better than they had in years, and the irony wasn't lost on her. In leaving civilization, they'd found abundance. But abundance brought its own complications. "We need more storage," Caleb said one evening in late August, surveying the plums Lena had been preserving. Jars lined every available surface in the cabin, filled with fruit that gleamed like jewels in the lamplight. "The harvest is going to be bigger than we can handle in here." "I've been thinking the same thing." Lena wiped her hands on her apron, sticky with sugar and fruit. "The spring house helps, but we'll need a proper root cellar before winter, somewhere to store potatoes and turnips, keep things from freezing. I can dig one into the hillside." He moved to the window, looking out at the valley bathed in evening light. "Use some of the timber from those dead trees near the North Ridge. Build it right. It'll last decades." "That's a lot of work for one man." "Then it's good I have help." He turned back with a slight smile. "Mary's got a strong back and Grace has an eye for detail. Between the three of us, we can manage." Lena wanted to argue that the girls were too young for such labor, but she'd watched them over the past weeks. They'd grown stronger in the valley, more capable. Mary could already outwork most grown women when it came to field labor, and Grace had a careful precision that made her invaluable for tasks requiring patience. Even Ruth contributed, gathering eggs and pulling weeds with cheerful determination. "All right," she conceded. "But you work in the morning and evening, not during the heat of the day. I won't have anyone getting sick from stubbornness." They started the root cellar the next morning, Caleb marking out the dimensions while Mary and Grace hauled rocks for the foundation. The work was brutal even in the cooler hours, and Lena watched her family labor with a mixture of pride and concern. This was what survival looked like without the cushion of civilization, everyone contributing, no task too small or too large to tackle together. Ruth appointed herself water bearer, making trips to the river with a bucket that was almost too heavy for her to carry. She took the job seriously, appearing at regular intervals to make sure everyone drank, her small face stern with responsibility. "You're keeping us alive, Ruth," Caleb told her on one of these visits, and the girl beamed with pride. By the end of the first week, they dug deep enough into the hillside to feel the temperature drop, cool earth exhaling its stored chill. Caleb reinforced the walls with timber, fitting the pieces together with the careful joints his father had taught him decades ago. Mary learned to use the saw, her movements growing more confident with each cut. Grace mixed clay and straw for chinking, plugging gaps with methodical thoroughness. Lena divided her time between preserving food and tending the garden, which had exploded with late summer growth. The abundance was almost overwhelming, more vegetables than they could possibly eat, fruit that ripened faster than she could process it. She worked from dawn until her hands were too tired to hold a knife, and still there was more. "This is a good problem to have," she told herself one afternoon, elbow deep in pickling brine. But part of her wondered what they'd do if this continued. They were 4 people in a valley that could support dozens. The surplus felt simultaneously like blessing and burden. That evening, as they gathered for supper, Grace voiced the question Lena had been avoiding. "What do we do with all the extra food? We can't eat it all even if we tried all winter." "We save what we can," Caleb answered, but his tone suggested he'd been thinking the same thing. "Come spring, if we still have surplus, we can think about trading. There's a settlement about 2 days' ride north of Silver City. Small enough that strangers aren't remarkable, big enough to have a market. But that means people knowing we're here, Mary said, her usual directness cutting to the heart of the matter. You said we were keeping this place secret. I said we weren't advertising it. Caleb set down his fork, giving the conversation his full attention. There's a difference between being hermits and being smart. We can trade without telling people where we're from. Just say we're homesteaders in the hills. Most folks won't ask for more detail than that.
And if they do,
Grace's worry was written in the crease between her eyebrows. Then we're vague. Lena joined the conversation, her mind working through the possibilities. We tell them we're north of here, or west, or somewhere that's true in the broadest sense, but doesn't give away the valley. People trade with strangers all the time without knowing their life stories. The discussion continued through supper, each of them contributing ideas. It was these moments that Lena treasured most. Not the work or the abundance, but the way they functioned as a unit. In Mineral Springs, Caleb had made decisions alone, burdened by the weight of providing and the shame of failing. Here, they planned together, the girls' voices carrying equal weight to the adults. I think we should wait until spring, Mary concluded, her practical nature asserting itself. See what we actually have surplus of, what travels well. No point planning a trading trip for produce that'll rot before we get to market. Agreed, Caleb said, and Lena nodded her approval. Sometimes the smartest plan was simply to wait and see. The root cellar was finished by early September, dug deep into the hillside and lined with shelves Caleb built from salvaged timber. They stored the first potatoes there with a sense of ceremony, Ruth carefully placing each one on the shelf, while Grace recorded the count in a ledger she'd started keeping. Mary tested the temperature daily, reporting with satisfaction that it stayed cool even when the afternoon sun beat down on the valley. Your grandfather would be proud, Lena told Caleb as they stood in the completed cellar, admiring the work. This is quality construction. He'd probably point out everything I did wrong, Caleb said, but he was smiling. Man had standards that would make a carpenter weep. Seems like he passed those standards on. She squeezed his hand. This place will keep us fed all winter and then some. But even as she said it, Lena felt the first whisper of unease. They'd been in the valley for nearly 2 months now, and not once had they seen another person. No hunters, no prospectors, no wandering travelers. It was as if the hills themselves kept people away, funneling them around the valley rather than through it. That kind of isolation was both protection and risk. If something went wrong, if one of them got seriously injured or sick, there was no one to call on for help. They were utterly, completely alone. She mentioned this to Caleb that night as they prepared for bed, keeping her voice low so the girls wouldn't hear. I know, he said quietly. I've been thinking about it too. We should put together a medical kit, best we can. And maybe I should teach you and Mary basic doctoring. Nothing fancy, but enough to handle emergencies. You know doctoring? I know field medicine from the war, how to set a bone, stitch a wound, recognize when someone's too far gone to save. His voice flattened on that last part. Not pleasant knowledge, but useful. Teach us, Lena said firmly. All of us, even Ruth. She's old enough to learn basic care. So in the evenings, after supper but before bed, Caleb became teacher. He showed them how to clean wounds properly, how to make poultices from plants that grew in the valley, how to splint broken bones using available materials. The girls listened with rapt attention, even Ruth, who practiced bandaging techniques on her corn husk doll with solemn concentration. You're making them grow up too fast, Lena worried aloud one night, watching Mary practice stitching on a piece of leather with thread and needle. I'm making them capable, Caleb corrected gently. There's a difference. Out here, capability isn't optional. It's survival. September slid into October, and the valley transformed. The trees that lined the river turned gold and crimson. The grass took on amber tones, and the air gained a crispness that felt like relief after summer's heat. They harvested the garden in stages, pulling vegetables and storing them with increasing efficiency. The corn came in heavy and sweet, the beans dried on the vine, and the squash grew to improbable sizes. Lena preserved everything she could, working until her hands cramped and her back ached. Pickled vegetables filled jar after jar. Dried beans lined the shelves. Corn was ground into meal and stored in the clay crocks from the spring house. They would eat well this winter, better than they'd eaten in their entire marriage. But it was the silver that occupied Caleb's thoughts more and more as autumn deepened. "We should work it," he said one evening, standing near the exposed vein in the hillside. "Not extensively, but enough to build a reserve. If we have a bad year, if something happens to the crops, we need backup." "How much backup?" Lena asked, though she already knew the answer. Caleb's father had written about not letting the silver consume them, but consumption was a gradual thing, easy to miss until you were already caught. "Enough to see us through an emergency, maybe enough to buy equipment we can't make ourselves. A proper plow, better tools, maybe even books for the girls' education." He ran his hand along the rock face. "This silver is just sitting here. Seems wasteful not to use it wisely." "Then use it wisely," Lena said carefully. "But remember what your father wrote. Real wealth is in what grows and endures. The silver is a tool, not a purpose." He nodded, but she could see the calculation in his eyes. The valley provided for their immediate needs, but security required more than food and shelter. It required options, cushions against disaster, the ability to respond to circumstances they couldn't predict. Caleb started working the silver in the mornings before the heat of the day. Mary joined him, learning to recognize valuable ore from waste rock, to extract cleanly without damaging the vein. They built up a supply slowly, storing the ore in the lean-to, planning for another trip to Silver City come spring. Meanwhile, Lena and Grace focused on skills that would serve them through winter and beyond. They learned to card and spin wool from the fleece Caleb had traded for on his last supply run. Grace proved to have nimble fingers and endless patience, producing yarn finer than anything Lena managed. Together they planned a loom, sketching designs based on descriptions from a book Grace had read. "If we can weave our own cloth," Grace reasoned, "we won't need to buy fabric. We can make our own clothes, our own blankets." "That's ambitious," Lena said, but she was impressed by the girl's thinking. "It'll take time to build a loom, learn the technique." "We have time." Grace looked around the cabin, at the food stores lining the walls, at the evidence of their growing competence. "We're not going anywhere." The first frost came in late October, arriving overnight and transforming the valley into a wonderland of white crystal. The girls woke to find the world changed, and their delight was pure and uncomplicated. They ran outside in their nightgowns despite Lena's protests, dancing through the frost-covered grass and laughing at the clouds their breath made in the cold air. Watching them, Lena felt something shift in her chest. These were not the same girls who'd huddled in a sweltering cottage while the town gossiped. Mary had grown taller, her shoulders broader from physical labor. Grace had lost her constant wariness, her face more open and relaxed. And Ruth had transformed from a timid child into a confident explorer, fearless in her conviction that the valley would keep her safe. "They're happy," Caleb said, coming to stand beside her on the porch. "Really happy, not just making the best of things." "So are we," Lena pointed out. "When's the last time you woke up dreading the day?" He considered this. "Can't remember. These days I wake up thinking about what needs doing, not what's going to go wrong." "That's what I mean." She leaned into his warmth. "We're not just surviving anymore. We're living." The frost signaled a change in their routine. Garden work ended, replaced by maintenance and preparation for winter. They patched the cabin's chinking, reinforced the lean-to for the animals, split and stacked firewood until they had more than enough. Caleb hunted deer and Lena learned to preserve the meat through smoking and salting. Nothing was wasted. Hides were tanned for leather, bones boiled for tools and glue, sinew saved for thread and binding. By November, they were ready for whatever winter might bring. The cabin was tight and warm. The food stores were abundant, and they had projects to keep them occupied during the short days ahead. Grace wanted to learn reading and writing at a higher level, so Lena became teacher, using the few books they had to create lessons. Mary asked Caleb to teach her mathematics, her practical mind recognizing its value for trading and planning. Ruth simply wanted stories, so every evening became story time, with each family member taking turns creating tales that grew more elaborate and ridiculous as winter deepened. The first significant snow fell in early December, covering the valley in white silence. They woke to find the world transformed, the river steaming in the cold air, The trees bowed under the weight of snow. For 3 days, the storm continued, confining them to the cabin and testing the preparation they'd made. But the cabin stayed warm, the food stores held, and the enforced proximity, which might have bred tension in another family, instead drew them closer. They played games with carved wooden pieces, sang songs from memory, told and retold their favorite stories until they could recite them by heart. "This is what winter's supposed to be," Mary observed one evening, watching snow fall past the window. "Not struggling to stay warm and fed, but resting up for spring." "You sound like an old farmer," Grace teased, but there was affection in her voice. "Maybe I am an old farmer," Mary shot back. "Someone's got to think practically around here." "I think practically," Ruth protested. "You think the chickens understand when you sing to them?" "They do understand. They lay better eggs when I sing." "That's not practical. That's magical thinking." "Girls," Lena interrupted, but she was smiling. These arguments were nothing like the tense silences of mineral springs. These were the comfortable squabbles of people who knew they were secure in each other's affection. The winter deepened, and with it came a quietness that Lena had never experienced. In town, winter meant huddling against cold while listening to neighbors through thin walls, hearing gossip even when you tried not to listen. Here, winter meant silence broken only by natural sounds: wind through trees, the crack of ice on the river, the call of winter birds. It was in this silence that Lena found herself thinking about the life they'd left behind, not with regret, but with a kind of wondering curiosity. What had happened after they disappeared? Had anyone looked for them, or had the town simply absorbed their absence and moved on? Did Mrs. Pemberton still hold court in the general store, or had she found new targets for her judgment? "Do you ever think about going back?" she asked Caleb one night, both of them unable to sleep despite the late hour. "Not to stay, just to visit. See what changed." "Sometimes," he admitted. "Wonder if they've noticed we're gone, if they've invented stories about what happened to us." "What do you think they're saying?" "Probably that I took you and the girls into the hills and got us all killed. That pride comes before a fall. That they tried to warn us." He shifted, wrapping an arm around her. "Does it matter what they think?" "Not really," Lena said, and realized it was true. "I'm just curious. Not about their opinions, but about whether they learned anything from us leaving." "People like that don't learn. They just find new people to judge." His voice carried a certainty born from experience. "We could go back dressed in silk with gold in our pockets, and they'd find something to criticize. Better to let them think whatever they want while we live, however we choose." "You're right," she said, but part of her still wondered, not because she needed validation, but because she'd spent so long under the weight of their judgment that its absence felt strange, like adjusting to sunlight after years in shadow. Christmas came without fanfare, marked by small celebrations rather than grand gestures. Lena made special treats with hoarded sugar, Caleb carved toys for the girls from scrap wood, and they sang carols that echoed through the cabin with more enthusiasm than skill. It was simple, humble, and perfect in its sincerity. "This is better than any Christmas in town," Ruth declared, hugging the wooden horse Caleb had made her. "In town, we always had to be quiet and proper. Here we can be loud." "We can be ourselves," Grace corrected gently. "That's what makes it better." As winter wore on into January, Lena noticed changes in the girls that went beyond physical growth. Mary had developed a confidence that bordered on swagger, her comfort with physical labor translating into a general competence that served her well. Grace had grown more vocal, her quiet observations becoming thoughtful contributions to family discussions. And Ruth, always the most adaptable, had become the Valley's fiercest defender, treating any suggestion of leaving like personal betrayal. "I'm never going back to town," she announced one evening with the absolute certainty only a 6-year-old could muster. "Towns are where people are mean. I like it here where everyone's nice." "Not everyone in town was mean," Lena said, though she struggled to think of examples. "Mrs. Wheeler was kind when she could be." "Only when her husband wasn't watching," Mary pointed out. "I remember her looking away when we walked past, like she was afraid being nice to us would cost her something." "It probably would have," Caleb said quietly. "Fear makes people small. They were afraid that being kind to us would put them on the outside too." "Then they were cowards." Mary's judgment was absolute. and I'm glad we don't live with cowards anymore." The bluntness should have shocked Lena, but instead she felt a surge of pride. Mary had learned to see clearly, to judge actions rather than accept excuses. That kind of clarity would serve her well in life, even if it made her abrasive to those who preferred comfortable lies. February brought a thaw, brief but unmistakable. The snow receded from south-facing slopes. The river ice cracked and shifted, and the air carried hints of the spring to come. It was during this thaw that they had their first visitor. Lena was hanging laundry when she heard it, the sound of a horse picking its way down the ridge trail. Her heart stopped for a moment, every fear about discovery flooding back. She dropped the shirt she'd been hanging and ran for the cabin. "Caleb, someone's coming!" He was at the door in seconds, rifle in hand. "Girls, upstairs, now. Don't come down until we call you." Mary started to argue, but something in his face stopped her. She herded her sisters up the ladder with quiet efficiency, and Lena heard the sound of the loft boards creaking as they positioned themselves to see through the cracks. The rider came into view slowly, an old man on an older horse, both looking worn from hard travel. He stopped at the edge of their clearing, taking in the cabin, the lean-to, the obvious signs of habitation. "Hello, the cabin," he called, voice rough with age and weather. "Hoping for some hospitality, if you can spare it." Caleb stepped onto the porch, rifle held casually but ready. "Who are you, and how'd you find this place?" "Name's Gideon Walsh, and I didn't find it so much as remember it." The old man dismounted stiffly, favoring his left leg. "Used to trap these hills 40 years ago, before the war. Remembered there was a valley here, thought I'd see if my memory was playing tricks." 40 years is a long time to remember a place you visited once. Wasn't just once. Gideon led his horse closer, moving slow and deliberate. "Spent a winter here, 1843 or thereabouts. Nearly died of fever, would have too if not for the valley's protection. Place has a way of keeping people alive if they're smart enough to accept the help." Lena stepped onto the porch beside Caleb. Something about the old man felt honest, but trust wasn't something they could afford to give freely. "What do you want?" she asked directly. "Just a meal and a place to sleep out of the cold. I'm too old to be sleeping rough, and my horse needs rest." He gestured at the animal, which did indeed look exhausted. "I can pay if that's your concern. Got some trade goods in my pack." Caleb and Lena exchanged glances, an entire conversation passing between them in silence. Turning away someone in need went against every principle they held, but bringing a stranger into their sanctuary risked everything they'd built. "One night," Caleb said finally, "you sleep in the lean-to with the animals, not in the cabin. We'll feed you and your horse, but come morning, you move on." "Fair enough?" Gideon nodded acceptance. "More than fair, considering you don't know me from Adam." They settled him in the lean-to with blankets and a promise of supper. The old man moved slowly, pain evident in every motion, but he seemed content with the arrangement. His horse, meanwhile, fell upon the hay Caleb provided with desperate hunger. Inside the cabin, Caleb called the girls down. "I want you three to stay in the loft while he's here. Don't come down unless I say so." "Why?" Ruth asked, her trust in the valley extending to anyone who entered it. "Because we don't know him," Mary answered before Caleb could speak. "And until we do, we're careful." That evening, they brought Gideon a plate of stew and cornbread, watching him eat with the focused intensity of someone who hadn't seen a proper meal in days. He thanked them with genuine gratitude, then surprised them by pulling items from his pack. Trade goods, like I said. Nothing fancy, but might be useful. He laid out his offerings: needles, thread, a small bag of salt, some dried tobacco, and a newspaper from Silver City dated 3 weeks prior. "We'll take the needles and salt," Lena said, already calculating what they could offer in trade. "We have some preserved fruit, if that interests you." "Interests me greatly," Gideon said. "Haven't had sweet food in longer than I care to admit." They made the trade, and Lena was about to retreat to the cabin when curiosity got the better of her. "The newspaper. What's the news from Silver City?" "Same as always. Mining disputes, weather complaints, usual territorial politics." He paused, studying her face. "You're not from around here originally, are you? Hear it in your voice." "We're homesteaders," Caleb said before Lena could answer. "Claimed this valley last summer." Smart claim. This place will provide if you work with it instead of against it. Gideon settled back against the lean-to wall. You planning to register the claim officially? Haven't decided yet, Caleb said, which was true enough. Seems like sometimes the less official attention a place gets, the better off it is. Can't argue with that. The old man's eyes were shrewd despite his age. Though I'll tell you this, land this good won't stay secret forever. Eventually someone else will remember it exists. And when they do, you'll want legal standing unless you're prepared to defend it with more than words. The warning settled over them like cold wind. I'll think on it, Caleb said neutrally. For now, we're managing fine. They left Gideon to his rest and retreated to the cabin, where the girls waited with barely contained questions. Is he dangerous? Grace asked immediately. I don't think so, Caleb answered. But dangerous and trustworthy aren't the same thing. He seems honest enough, but he's also a stranger who found a place we thought was hidden. He said it won't stay secret, Lena added, speaking the fear aloud, that eventually people will remember it exists. Then we make sure we're established enough that it doesn't matter, Mary said with characteristic directness. We register the claim, build more structures, make it obvious this is ours. Nobody can take it if we prove we were here first. Mary's right, Grace agreed. We can't keep hiding forever. Eventually, we have to claim what's ours out loud. Lena looked at Caleb, seeing her own uncertainty reflected in his face. They'd found this place through desperation, built a life here through determination. But making it official meant announcing themselves, inviting exactly the kind of attention they'd been avoiding. We'll talk about it in the morning, Caleb decided, after Gideon leaves and we can think clearly. But sleep didn't come easily that night. Lena lay awake listening to the valley's night sounds, wondering if they'd been foolish to think they could keep this place secret forever. The girls had been right. Eventually they'd have to choose between hiding and claiming. And hiding, she was beginning to realize, was just another form of fear. Morning came cold and clear, and Gideon was already packing his horse when they emerged from the cabin. He accepted the breakfast Lena provided with grateful efficiency, eating quickly like a man accustomed to traveling on limited time. I appreciate the hospitality, he said as he prepared to leave. Won't forget it. Gideon, Caleb said suddenly, that advice you gave last night about registering the claim, you think that's really necessary? The old man considered. I think if you've got something worth protecting, you protect it with every tool available. Law's a tool, same as a rifle or a fence. And out here, sometimes law's the only thing standing between what's yours and what someone else decides to take. He mounted his horse with visible effort, then tipped his hat to them. You've got a good place here. Don't lose it through stubbornness or fear. Sometimes the bravest thing is standing up and saying, "This is mine," loud enough that everyone hears. They watched him ride up the ridge trail, disappearing over the top without looking back. When he was gone, the valley felt simultaneously emptier and more vulnerable. He's right, Caleb said quietly. We can't protect this place by pretending it doesn't exist. We have to claim it, make it official, establish ourselves legally. That means going to the land office, Lena said. Means people knowing we're here. Means people knowing a valley exists somewhere in these hills. We don't have to give exact coordinates, just enough to register the claim and establish our rights. He turned to her, his expression determined. Lena, we've spent too long being invisible, letting other people's judgment make us small. I don't want to do that here. I want to stand up and say this is ours. We built it. We're staying. Looking at him, Lena saw the man she'd married, not the defeated figure bent under Mineral Springs' scorn, but the person he was meant to be, confident, capable, ready to claim what he'd earned. Then we claim it, she said firmly. Come spring, when travel's easier, we go to the land office and make this official. And if anyone has a problem with it, they can take it up with us directly. The decision settled something in all of them. That evening, they sat together planning not how to hide, but how to establish themselves properly. They would register the claim, build permanent structures, create something so obviously established that no one could question their right to be there. The girls contributed ideas with enthusiasm. A proper barn for the animals, maybe a schoolhouse where Grace could teach Ruth properly. A workshop where Caleb and Mary could work the silver more efficiently. We're not just surviving anymore, Mary said. echoing words Lena had spoken months ago. We're building something that lasts. And as winter gradually loosened its grip and the first hints of spring appeared in longer days and melting snow, Lena felt the shift complete itself. They'd come to the valley as refugees, running from judgment and failure. But they would stay as builders, claiming not just the land but the right to determine their own worth. The town's opinion no longer mattered. The silver was a tool, not a temptation. And the valley that had saved them was about to become officially, legally, permanently theirs. Not hidden away like a shameful secret, but proclaimed like the victory it truly was. Spring arrived not with a single moment of transformation, but with a gradual accumulation of changes too small to notice individually, but impossible to ignore collectively. The snow retreated in uneven patches, leaving behind earth that steamed in the strengthening sunlight. Ice on the river fractured into geometric patterns that shifted and groaned through the nights. The trees along the water's edge developed swollen buds that would soon burst into green, and the air itself changed texture, losing winter's knife-edge clarity in favor of something softer and more forgiving. Caleb chose a morning in late March to make the trip to the land office, waiting until the mountain passes were reliably clear and the weather had settled into something approaching predictability. He loaded the wagon with supplies they could spare for trading, tucked the carefully written claim description into his coat pocket, and kissed Lena with more intensity than a 3-day trip warranted. "You're acting like you're going to war," she said against his mouth, trying to lighten the moment even as her own anxiety twisted in her stomach. "Feels similar," he admitted. "Going out there, making ourselves known. It's a risk. It's also necessary." She stepped back, keeping her hands on his shoulders. "We agreed. Hiding isn't protecting. We need the law on our side." "I know." He glanced toward the cabin where the girls were finishing breakfast, their voices carrying through the open door. "Just don't like leaving you here alone. If something happened, nothing's going to happen that we can't handle." Lena's voice firmed with conviction she mostly felt. "We've got the rifle, we've got each other, and we've got 3 days to prove we don't need rescuing. Go register our claim, Caleb. Make this place officially ours." He climbed onto the wagon seat, gathering the reins with hands that had grown calloused and strong over the winter. The man who'd sat defeated on a cottage step last summer was gone, replaced by someone who sat straighter, looked forward instead of down, wore competence like a well-fitted coat. 3 days, he promised. 4 at most if the land office gives me trouble. "We'll be here when you get back." She watched him navigate the wagon up the ridge trail, the same path they'd descended 9 months ago with nothing but desperate hope and a dead man's directions. The wagon disappeared over the top, and Lena stood alone in the clearing, feeling the weight of responsibility settle across her shoulders like a yoke. Behind her, the cabin door opened and Mary emerged, wiping her hands on her apron with brisk efficiency. "He's gone?" "Just now." Lena turned to face her stepdaughter, struck again by how much the girl had changed. Taller, yes, but also more present somehow. More solid in her own skin. "Good." Mary's practicality reasserted itself immediately. "Because we've got work to do, and I'd rather start before it gets too warm. Grace found something this morning I think you need to see." They walked to the northern hillside where Grace waited near the silver vein, her expression troubled. Ruth sat nearby, collecting interesting rocks, humming to herself in the way she did when concentrating. "What is it?" Lena asked, though the answer became obvious as soon as Grace pointed. Fresh marks in the rock face. New, clean cuts that hadn't been there 2 days ago. Someone had been here. Someone had found the silver. "Could be animals," Lena suggested without conviction. "Animals don't use chisels." Grace pointed to a gouge in the rock that was unmistakably man-made. "Someone came while we were sleeping. They didn't take much, but they know it's here now." The implications crashed over Lena like cold water. Gideon. It had to be. The old man who'd seemed so harmless, who'd shared a meal and moved on. He must have circled back, waited until Caleb left, then investigated the hillside he'd probably noticed on his first visit. "How much did they take?" Lena's voice came out steadier than she felt. "Not much, maybe a few pounds of ore, but that's not what worries me." Mary had joined them, her face set in grim lines. "What worries me is that they know, and knowledge like that doesn't stay quiet. We don't know it was Gideon, Grace said, though her tone suggested she knew as well as anyone. Could be someone else who found the valley. Doesn't matter who. Mary's bluntness cut through false hope. Matters that someone knows about the silver. And if Papa's not back for 3 days, we need to decide what we're doing about it. Lena looked at the three girls watching her with varying degrees of concern and determination. Mary, ready to fight. Grace, worried but practical. Ruth, not fully understanding the danger but picking up on the tension. They were waiting for her to lead, to make decisions, to be the adult in charge. We finish what we started, she said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. Grace, you and Ruth work the garden like we planned. Mary, you and I are going to make sure the cabin is secured. If someone comes back, I want us ready. They spent the day in purposeful activity that barely masked underlying fear. Lena checked the rifle, counting bullets and making sure the mechanism worked smoothly. Mary reinforced the cabin door with an additional crossbar, then fashioned shutters for the windows that could be closed and barred from inside. Grace kept Ruth occupied with garden tasks, but Lena caught her glancing toward the ridge more than once, watching for movement that didn't come. That night, they slept with the rifle propped beside the door, and the shutters closed despite the stuffiness it created. Lena lay awake listening to every sound, interpreting each crack of settling timber or call of nightbirds as potential threat. The valley that had felt like sanctuary now felt exposed, vulnerable in ways she hadn't considered when they'd first arrived. Morning brought no new disturbances, but the anxiety remained. They went through their routines with forced normalcy, tending animals and preparing meals while stealing glances toward the hillside where the silver waited like bait in a trap. It was Ruth who spotted the rider first, her young eyes catching movement where the adults had seen nothing. "Someone's coming," she said calmly, pointing toward the eastern ridge. "Different trail than Papa took." Lena's heart hammered as she followed the girl's finger. Sure enough, a horse picked its way down the slope, but not from the direction of their main trail. This rider had found another way in, suggesting knowledge of the valley that went beyond lucky discovery. "Girls inside. Now!" Lena grabbed the rifle, checking the load with shaking hands. "Mary, you know how to shoot if you have to." "I know how." Mary's face was pale but determined. "But I'm not hiding inside while you face this alone." "Mary." "No." The girl's voice carried absolute conviction. "We're a family. We face things together, or we don't face them at all. Papa would say the same thing." There was no time to argue. The rider was closer now, and Lena could see it was a man, middle-aged, wearing clothes that suggested he had means. Not a drifter or a prospector, but someone with purpose and resources. He stopped at the edge of their clearing, hands visible and empty, but his eyes were busy cataloging everything: the cabin, the lean-to, the garden plot, the obvious signs of established habitation. "Mrs. Moore?" he called. "I'm hoping we can talk peacefully." "I'm not here to cause trouble." The use of her name sent ice through Lena's veins. "Who are you, and what do you want?" "Name's Richard Patterson. I own the Consolidated Mining Company out of Silver City, and I'm here because an associate of mine mentioned you folks might be sitting on something valuable." Gideon. The betrayal stung even though Lena had suspected it. The old man's kindness had been reconnaissance, his gratitude a prelude to claiming what wasn't his. "This is our land," Lena said, proud that her voice didn't shake. "We claimed it, we worked it, and we're in the process of making it legal." "I'm sure you are." Patterson dismounted slowly, still keeping his hands visible. "And I'm not disputing your right to homestead. But mineral rights are a different matter, Mrs. Moore. Unless you filed a mining claim specifically, any ore found on this land falls under territorial law, which means it can be claimed by whoever files first." "You're saying you want our silver?" Mary spoke up, stepping beside Lena with her chin raised. "After we found it, after we worked for it." "I'm saying the law's complicated, young lady, and complications tend to favor those who can afford good lawyers." Patterson's smile was practiced, professional. "But I'm not here to steal from you. I'm here to make a fair offer. You sell me the mineral rights, I pay you a percentage of whatever we extract, everyone benefits." "And if we say no?" Lena asked, though she already knew the answer. "Then I file my own claim, tie you up in legal disputes you can't afford to fight, and eventually extract the silver anyway. Only in that scenario you get nothing but debt and headache. He spread his hands in a gesture of false reasonableness. I'm giving you the chance to profit from this, Mrs. Moore. Most people in your position don't get offered that courtesy. Lena's mind raced through options, each one bleaker than the last. They had no legal standing yet, no registered claim, no way to prove they'd found the silver first. Patterson had resources, connections, lawyers who could twist territorial law to serve his interests. Fighting him would mean exposing themselves to exactly the kind of attention they'd been avoiding, bringing scrutiny that might reveal other vulnerabilities. But surrendering felt like betrayal. They'd found this place when they had nothing. The silver was supposed to be their security, their cushion against disaster. Giving it up to a man who'd done nothing but show up with threats disguised as opportunities went against everything they'd built. We need time to think about it, Lena said, stalling. Of course, these are big decisions. Patterson remounted his horse with easy confidence. I'll give you 3 days. After that, I file my claim regardless of your answer. At least if you agree to my terms, you'll see some benefit. Otherwise, you'll spend the next year watching me extract wealth from your land while legal battles drain whatever savings you have. He rode out the same way he'd come, and Lena watched him go with fury and fear competing for dominance in her chest. When he disappeared over the ridge, she lowered the rifle with hands that trembled from more than exertion. What are we going to do? Grace asked quietly. I don't know. The admission hurt. But we're not deciding anything until your papa gets back. This isn't my choice to make alone. They spent the next day in tense waiting, jumping at shadows and second-guessing every decision. Lena considered sending Mary to intercept Caleb on the road, bringing him back early. But dividing their small group seemed more dangerous than waiting, and Mary agreed. Papa needs to finish at the land office, she reasoned. If we can get the homestead registered, it gives us something to stand on. Better than nothing. Caleb returned on the evening of the 3rd day, earlier than expected and driving the wagon with unusual urgency. He'd barely stopped before Lena was there, words spilling out about Patterson and Gideon and the threat hanging over their silver. I know, he said, climbing down stiffly. I heard in Silver City, Patterson's been talking about a new claim in the hills, telling anyone who'll listen that he's about to open a productive vein. I rode hard to get back before he could make his move official. Did you register the homestead? I did. We've got legal claim to the surface rights, the cabin, the land we're farming, but the clerk warned me about mineral rights being separate. Said I should file a mining claim too, but I'd already spent our registration fee on the homestead. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident. I thought we had more time. So what do we do? Mary had joined them, her usual directness cutting to the essential question. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving across the valley that had saved them, the land they'd worked, the life they'd built from nothing, and determination. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight Lena recognized from his most serious decisions. We don't give him the silver, not the rights, not a percentage, nothing. We fight. With what? Lena asked. He's got money, lawyers, influence. We've got a homestead claim and determination. We've got more than that. Caleb turned to face her fully. We've got the truth. We found this place when no one else knew it existed. We built this life with our own hands, and we've got legal claim to the surface, which means any mining operation has to go through us to access the ore. He can get permission from the territorial government, Grace pointed out, her careful mind working through the implications. Force access through legal channels. Maybe. But that takes time, and time is something we can use. Caleb's expression hardened with determination. Patterson wants easy profit with minimal effort. We make it difficult enough, expensive enough, complicated enough, and he'll look for easier opportunities elsewhere. Or he'll dig in harder out of spite, Mary countered. Then we dig in harder too. Caleb looked at each of them in turn. I didn't bring us here to give up the first time someone threatened what we built. We ran from Mineral Springs because we had no standing to fight. But here, we've got legal claim, we've got rights, and we've got each other. That's more than enough. Lena felt something shift in her chest, fear transmuting into something fiercer. He was right. They'd spent too long being small, accepting that powerful people made decisions for the powerless. But they weren't powerless here. They were established, they were legal, and they were done backing down. Then we fight, she agreed, but we fight smart. We use every legal tool available, every delay we can create, every complication we can introduce. Make it cost him more than it's worth. They spent that evening planning strategy with the same careful attention they'd given to planning crops and preserving food. Caleb would return to Silver City and consult with a lawyer, using some of their silver reserves to pay for legal advice. Lena would document everything they'd done to improve the land, creating evidence of their investment and establishment. The girls would help maintain the homestead, making it visibly productive and clearly inhabited. "What about Patterson's deadline?" Grace asked. "He said 3 days. "Let him file his mining claim," Caleb said. "We can't stop that. But we can challenge it, dispute the boundaries, question his right to access through our homesteaded land. Every legal objection we raise costs him time and money. And if he brings in workers anyway?" Mary's practicality demanded consideration of worse scenarios. "If he just starts mining, regardless of legal status?" "Then we document it as trespass and sue." Caleb's voice was hard. "I'm done being pushed around by people who think money gives them the right to take whatever they want. Patterson's going to learn that sometimes the people you try to steal from fight back." The next morning, Caleb rode out again, this time toward Silver City, with purpose rather than dread. Lena watched him go with pride and fear tangled together. They were taking a stand, but stands came with costs they might not be able to afford. Left alone with the girls again, Lena threw herself into visible productivity. They expanded the garden, built a fence around the chicken run, started construction on a proper barn that would replace the lean-to. Every improvement was documented in Grace's careful handwriting, dated and described with precision that would serve as evidence if needed. Patterson returned 4 days later, this time with 2 workers and surveying equipment. He was polite but firm, showing Lena the filed mining claim that gave him legal right to the silver vein. "I tried to make this easy," he said, almost apologetically. "But you've chosen the hard way. So now we do this officially. I'll be extracting ore from the northern hillside, and I've got territorial permission to cross your homestead for access." "You've got permission to cross," Lena agreed, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "But that doesn't give you permission to damage our property, disturb our livestock, or interfere with our farming operations. Any impact to our homestead gives us legal grounds for damages." Patterson's expression tightened. "You've been talking to a lawyer." "We've been educating ourselves on our rights." Mary appeared beside Lena, her young face set in hard lines. "And we know that homestead rights supersede mining claims when it comes to surface damage. You want that silver? You'll extract it in ways that don't harm our land, or you'll pay for every broken fence and trampled crop." The mine owner studied them both, reassessing. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be." "You're taking something that should be ours," Lena countered. "We're just making sure you don't take anything else in the process." The standoff continued through the following weeks. Patterson's workers began extracting ore, but every operation was watched by Lena or one of the girls. When they damaged a fence during transport, Lena documented it with measurements and drawings, filing a formal complaint that delayed their next shipment. When their equipment scared the cow, causing a drop in milk production, she calculated lost value and presented Patterson with a bill. Each complication added cost and frustration. The workers grumbled about the difficulty of access, the constant supervision, the legal restrictions that slowed their progress. Patterson himself grew visibly irritated, his polite facade cracking under the weight of delays and expenses he hadn't anticipated. Caleb returned after a week with news from the lawyer. "We can't stop the mining entirely, but we can make it expensive. Every claim we file for damages has to be addressed. Every restriction we place on access routes has to be negotiated. And the lawyer says if we can prove Patterson's operation is interfering with our primary use of the land, farming and ranching, we can petition for the mining claim to be modified or moved." "Can we prove that?" Lena asked. "If their operations get any bigger, yes. Right now it's borderline, but the lawyer thinks if we document everything carefully, we've got a case." He pulled out papers covered in legal language. "It'll cost money we don't have much of, and it'll take time. But Patterson's losing money every day his operation is slowed down. Eventually, the math won't work in his favor." They settled into an uncomfortable equilibrium. Patterson's workers extracted silver at a fraction of the rate they'd hoped for, frustrated by restrictions and oversight. Lena and the girls maintained vigilant documentation, turning every minor incident into paperwork that required response. Caleb worked with the lawyer in Silver City, building a legal case that grew stronger with each passing week. But the tension wore on all of them. The valley that had been sanctuary now felt like a battlefield, its peace shattered by the constant presence of outsiders. The girls grew quieter, more watchful. Lena found herself exhausted, not from physical labor, but from constant vigilance. And Caleb, despite his determination, showed the strain of fighting a battle that seemed to have no clear ending. It was Grace who finally spoke the truth they'd all been avoiding. One evening, after another long day of watching Patterson's workers haul ore from their hillside, she asked the question that haunted them all. Is it worth it? Fighting this hard for silver we're not even getting to keep? The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken thoughts. Mary looked angry, as if the question itself was betrayal. Ruth looked confused, not fully understanding the complexity. And Caleb and Lena exchanged glances that held months of accumulated stress. It's not about the silver, Lena said finally. Not really. It's about whether we let people take from us just because they can, or whether we stand up for what's ours. But it's costing us, Grace persisted, her practical nature demanding honesty. Money for the lawyer, time we could spend on other things, peace we used to have. Is proving a point worth all that? It's not just a point, Mary argued. It's principle. If we let Patterson take the silver without fighting, what stops the next person from taking something else? Where do we draw the line between protecting ourselves and just rolling over? Maybe the line is when the cost of fighting exceeds the value of what we're protecting, Grace said quietly. I'm not saying we should give up. I'm saying we should think about what we're really fighting for and whether there's a smarter way to win. The words settled over them like dust, uncomfortable but impossible to ignore. Lena looked at her stepdaughter with new appreciation. Grace had inherited her mother's quiet wisdom, the ability to see clearly when others were blinded by emotion or principle. What are you suggesting? Caleb asked, his voice neutral. I'm suggesting we talk to Patterson again. Not to surrender, but to negotiate from strength. Grace's eyes were thoughtful. We've proven we can make his operation expensive and difficult. He knows we're not going away. Maybe now he's ready to make a real deal instead of the insulting offer he started with. Or maybe he'll see it as weakness, Mary countered. See us backing down and push harder. Or maybe Grace is right, Lena said slowly, the idea taking shape as she spoke. We've changed the balance of power. When Patterson first came here, he thought we were helpless homesteaders he could push around. But we've proven we're not. We've got legal standing, we're willing to fight, and we're costing him more than he expected. That's not weakness. That's leverage. Caleb was quiet, thinking. Finally, he nodded. All right, we approach Patterson, but on our terms. Not begging for mercy, but offering to negotiate a fair deal. He gets access to the silver without the constant legal battles. We get proper compensation and protection for our homestead. Both sides win. They sent word to Patterson through his workers, requesting a meeting. He arrived 2 days later, looking worn from weeks of complicated operations and legal maneuvering. But there was respect in his eyes now that hadn't been there before. Mrs. Moore, Mr. Moore. He nodded to them both. Your message said you wanted to discuss terms. We do, Caleb confirmed, but not the terms you offered before. We've proven we can make your operation difficult and expensive. Now we're offering to make it easier for a price. What price? 20% of gross ore value, Lena stated clearly. Paid monthly, with full accounting, written guarantee that your operation won't expand beyond the northern hillside, with penalties if you damage our property or livestock. An acknowledgement in writing that we discovered the silver first, even if we couldn't file the claim in time. Patterson's eyebrows rose. That's a steep price. It's fair compensation for our discovery, and for the disruption to our homestead, Caleb countered. And it's cheaper than continuing to fight us through legal channels while your operation bleeds money from delays. The mine owner considered, his expression calculating. 15%. And I want guaranteed access without harassment. 18%, Lena negotiated. And access without unreasonable harassment. We reserve the right to document any damage and seek compensation, but we won't create obstacles just for spite. 17%, and you sign a waiver giving up future damage claims except for gross negligence. 17.5%, and we keep the right to claim damages for any disruption to our primary homestead operations. Mary spoke up, her voice firm. If your mining interferes with our farming or ranching in ways that cost us money, you're responsible. Patterson looked at the young girl with something like admiration. You drive a hard bargain, miss. I learned from good teachers, Mary said, glancing at Caleb and Lena. The negotiation continued through the afternoon. Details refined and clarified until both sides felt the terms were fair, if not ideal. Patterson would extract silver under controlled conditions, paying them a percentage that would provide security without requiring them to do the mining themselves. They would maintain their homestead without constant battle, free to focus on farming and family rather than legal warfare. When the final agreement was written out and signed, witnessed by Patterson's foreman and Grace's careful notations, Lena felt something release in her chest. Not victory exactly, but resolution. They hadn't gotten everything they wanted, but they'd gotten enough. And more importantly, they'd proven they couldn't be pushed around. After Patterson left, heading back to Silver City with the agreement that would govern their relationship going forward, the family gathered on the cabin porch as evening settled over the valley. The mining operation would continue, but now it felt less like invasion and more like compromise. Uncomfortable, perhaps, but manageable. Did we do the right thing? Ruth asked, seeking reassurance in the way children do. We did the necessary thing, Caleb answered. Sometimes that's the same as the right thing, sometimes it's not. But we protected what matters most, our home, our family, our ability to live here on our terms. And we got paid for it, Mary added with satisfaction. 17.5% of silver we would never have mined ourselves. That's not losing, that's winning differently than we planned. Grace, quiet through most of the evening, finally spoke. Papa, Mama Lena, thank you for listening. I know I'm young, and I worried you'd think I was being cowardly by suggesting negotiation. You weren't being cowardly, Lena assured her, pulling the girl close. You were being wise. There's a difference between fighting because you have to, and fighting because you're too proud to see another option. You helped us see the other option. They sat together as the stars emerged, the valley settling into its night sounds around them. The mining operation had changed things. There was no denying it. The absolute solitude they'd enjoyed was gone, replaced by the awareness that others knew this place existed. But they'd also gained something, proof that they could stand up for themselves, negotiate from strength, protect what mattered without destroying themselves in the process. Your grandfather would be proud, Caleb said quietly, more to himself than anyone. He left us this place for desperate times, and we used it not just to survive, but to build something lasting. Even when someone tried to take it from us, we found a way to turn that into opportunity. Lena looked around at her family, Caleb, solid and determined, Mary, fierce and practical, Grace, wise beyond her years, Ruth, still innocent but growing stronger. They'd come to this valley as refugees running from a town that couldn't see their worth, and in 9 months, they'd transformed into something new. Not people who hid from challenges, but people who faced them with clear eyes and determined hearts. The summer heat that had driven them here seemed like another lifetime. The eviction notice that had sparked their journey was ash scattered in some forgotten fire, and the judgment of Mineral Springs, once so heavy it had nearly crushed them, now felt like noise from a world that no longer had any claim on their attention. They were home, not in the sense of a place they'd always known, but in the sense of a place they'd earned. And tomorrow, they would wake up and continue building, continue growing, continue proving that real wealth wasn't measured in silver or approval, but in the strength to face challenges together and the wisdom to know when to fight and when to negotiate. The valley had saved them, but more importantly, they had saved themselves. The first payment from Patterson arrived 6 weeks after the agreement was signed, delivered by his foreman in a leather pouch that clinked with the weight of actual currency rather than promises. Caleb counted it twice on the cabin table while Lena and the girls watched, the silver coins catching lamplight and throwing it back in bright flashes that seemed almost unreal. $63, Caleb announced, his voice carrying disbelief. For 6 weeks of ore extraction, we didn't have to dig ourselves. That's more than you made in 3 months of field work in Mineral Springs, Mary observed, her practical mind already calculating. And this will come every month? According to the agreement, Lena picked up one of the coins, testing its weight. Patterson's operation is producing well. If this keeps up, we'll have real security by year's end. But it was Grace who voiced the question that had been building in all of them. What do we do with it? The money, I mean. We've got food, shelter, everything we need. What's it for? The question hung in the air, more complicated than it seemed. For so long, money had meant survival, paying rent, buying food, staying one step ahead of disaster. But they weren't in that place anymore. The valley provided for their immediate needs, and the homestead was established enough that basic survival no longer consumed every thought and effort. We save some, Caleb said finally, build a reserve against bad years or emergencies. But the rest, he looked at Lena, and she saw the question in his eyes. The rest we use to build the life we want, not just the life we need, she finished. Books for Grace, proper tools for Mary. Maybe even travel to a real town occasionally, so the girls know there's a world beyond these hills. And for you and Papa? Ruth asked. What do you want? The question caught Lena off guard. For a year, she'd been so focused on what the girls needed, what the homestead required, what survival demanded, that her own wants had become invisible even to herself. She looked at Caleb and saw the same realization dawning on his face. I want time, he said slowly. Time to sit on the porch without worrying. Time to teach you girls things my father taught me. Time to just be, without everything being about survival. I want the same, Lena agreed. But I also want something to show for all this. Not to prove anything to Mineral Springs, but to prove something to ourselves. That we didn't just survive, we thrived. The conversation continued through the evening, dreams expanding to fill the space that had previously been occupied by fear and desperation. They talked about improvements to the cabin, about purchasing livestock beyond what they currently had, about possibly hiring help during harvest season so they weren't constantly exhausted by the work. It was the last suggestion that sparked the most debate. Hiring help means bringing strangers here, Mary pointed out, means more people knowing about the valley. The valley's not a secret anymore anyway, Grace countered. Patterson's workers know about it. Gideon knew about it. Eventually, others will find it too. We can't keep it hidden forever. Then maybe we stop trying to hide it, Lena said, the idea forming as she spoke. Maybe we claim it openly, build it into something that's obviously ours. Not just a homestead, but a real ranch, something substantial enough that no one can question our right to be here. A ranch needs more than just us, Caleb mused. Needs cattle, horses, proper barns, and fencing. That takes capital we're just starting to accumulate. But we are accumulating it. Mary's eyes gleamed with the same practical intensity she brought to every project. If Patterson's payments continue like this, we could have enough by next spring to make real purchases. Start building something bigger. The idea took root over the following weeks, growing from vague possibility into concrete planning. Lena found herself sketching layouts for expanded operations, where a larger barn would go, how many head of cattle the valley could support, what crops would be most profitable if they cultivated more land. Grace researched ranching operations in the few books they had, taking careful notes on best practices and common pitfalls. Even Ruth contributed, enthusiastically naming the future cattle with elaborate stories about their personalities and preferences. But it was Mary who brought the practical reality check. If we're building a ranch, we need to think about who's going to work it. Papa and I can handle a lot, but we can't manage dozens of cattle plus farming plus everything else. We need help, which means either hiring hands or... She paused, the unspoken alternative hanging in the air. Or what? Lena prompted. Or we find a way to make the ranch less labor-intensive. Smaller herd but higher quality. Focus on breeding stock instead of beef cattle. Something that brings in money without requiring an army of workers. It was smart thinking, and it resonated with Lena's own instincts about keeping their operation manageable and under their control. They'd fought too hard for independence to immediately surrender it by becoming employers of a workforce they'd have to manage. Summer arrived with the same heat that had driven them from Mineral Springs a year earlier, but this time the temperature felt different. Oppressive, yes, but also productive. The garden exploded with growth. The fruit trees bent under the weight of their yield. And Patterson's mining operation, now running smoothly under the terms of their agreement, continued to generate monthly payments that steadily built their reserves. It was during this summer that Lena made a decision that surprised even herself. I want to go back, she announced one evening. To Mineral Springs, just for a day, to see what's changed. The silence that followed was profound. Caleb stared at her as if she'd suggested flying to the moon. The girls exchanged confused glances. "Why?" Mary finally asked, her voice carrying genuine bewilderment. "What's there for us?" "Nothing," Lena admitted. "And that's exactly why I want to go, to prove to myself that there really is nothing there, that we didn't run away from something valuable, we ran toward something better." "You don't need to prove that," Caleb said gently. "We're living the proof every day." "I know, but I think I need to see it with my own eyes. Close that chapter properly instead of just leaving it hanging open." She looked around at her family, trying to make them understand. "We left in desperation and fear. I want to go back in strength and certainty just once, and then never think about that place again." Grace surprised her by nodding. "I understand. It's like finishing a book properly instead of just stopping in the middle. Even if you know how it ends, you need to read the last page." "Exactly." Lena squeezed the girl's hand gratefully. They discussed it through the evening, and eventually Caleb agreed to accompany her on the trip. Mary would stay with Grace and Ruth, managing the homestead with the competence she'd developed over the past year. They'd be gone 3 days, one to travel there, one in town, one to return. The journey to Mineral Springs felt surreal, traveling in reverse the path they'd taken in desperate flight. The drought that had plagued the territory last summer had broken, and the land looked greener, more forgiving. But Lena knew the appearance was deceptive. The land hadn't changed, only her perspective had. They arrived in Mineral Springs on a Tuesday afternoon, driving into town with the same wagon that had carried them out, though now it was in better repair and they sat straighter, looked forward instead of down. Lena had dressed carefully that morning, not in her finest clothes, those had been sold months ago, but in a dress she'd sewn herself from fabric purchased with Patterson's payments. Simple, well-made, dignified. The town looked exactly the same. The general store still occupied its corner, the bank stood solid and imposing, the church steeple rose above the other buildings like a finger pointing toward judgment. But something had changed, and it took Lena a moment to realize what it was. She didn't care anymore. The weight of their opinion, once so crushing it had bent her spine, now felt like nothing. Less than nothing, like trying to be pressed down by shadows or smoke. They hitched the wagon in front of the general store, and Lena took a breath before stepping down. The street was busy with mid-afternoon traffic, and she could already see heads turning, whispers starting. Word would spread fast that the Moores had returned. Mrs. Pemberton emerged from the store before they'd taken 3 steps, her fan already in motion despite the moderate temperature. "Lena Harper," she caught herself. "Mrs. Moore? My goodness, we'd heard you'd all perished in the hills. Where on earth have you been?" "Building a life," Lena answered simply. "We homesteaded land northeast of here. Doing quite well, actually." "Homesteaded?" The older woman's fan stuttered in its rhythm. "But the cottage, the landlord said you'd abandoned it without paying what you owed." "We left what we couldn't take with us," Caleb said, his voice level. "Seemed pointless to pay rent on a place we weren't living in anymore." "But you just disappeared. The whole town was talking. We thought—" Mrs. Pemberton floundered, her usual certainty undermined by their obvious health and calm demeanor. "What did you think?" Lena asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. "That we'd died? That we'd failed?" "Well, yes. I mean, you left with nothing. 3 children and a wagon full of desperation. What else were we supposed to think?" "You were supposed to think we were capable of building something better than what we had here," Mary said, appearing from behind the wagon where she'd been checking the wheels. She'd insisted on coming at the last minute, unable to let her parents face the town alone. But thinking the best of people was never this town's strength. The bluntness made Mrs. Pemberton's face flush. "Well, No, you never did," Mary agreed. "You never thought Papa was good enough, never thought Mama Lena made a smart choice, never thought we girls were anything but burdens. But we're doing fine anyway. Better than fine. So maybe your thoughts on the subject weren't as important as you believed." Other townspeople had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Lena recognized faces from a year ago, the banker's wife, the feed store owner, the women who'd whispered in corners about poor choices and predictable failures. They all watched now with expressions ranging from shock to curiosity to something that might have been embarrassment. "You're really doing well?" the banker's wife asked, her tone suggesting she couldn't quite believe it. "Out in the wilderness with nothing?" "We have everything we need," Lena corrected. "A solid cabin, productive land, reliable income. The girls are healthy and educated. We eat well, sleep soundly, and wake up each morning grateful for what we've built." "Income from what?" Mrs. Pemberton's skepticism was reflexive. What could possibly generate income in the middle of nowhere? Lena exchanged glances with Caleb, and they shared a smile that held a year's worth of private victories. "We have an arrangement with a mining company," she said, keeping the details deliberately vague. "Our land holds valuable resources. We've negotiated fair compensation for extraction rights." The revelation sent a visible ripple through the gathered crowd. Mining meant money. Real money. The kind of money that couldn't be dismissed or minimized. "You struck silver?" The feed store owner's voice carried a mixture of respect and envy. "We found an opportunity and negotiated intelligently," Caleb said, his tone making it clear they wouldn't be discussing specifics. "But we didn't come here to talk about our business. We came to put some things to rest and move forward." "What things?" Mrs. Pemberton asked, her fan moving faster. Lena took a breath, gathering the words she'd been rehearsing since deciding to make this trip. "A year ago, I stood in your store counting out coins for flour while you discussed my poor judgment and unfortunate circumstances. You and half the town had decided I'd made a mistake marrying Caleb, that his daughters were burdens, that we were destined to fail. We were concerned," the banker's wife started, but Lena continued as if she hadn't spoken. "You weren't concerned. You were entertained. Our struggle gave you something to talk about over tea, something to make yourselves feel superior by comparison. And when we left, you probably felt vindicated. See, you told each other we were right about them all along." The silence that followed was thick with discomfort. No one seemed to know where to look. "But here's what you didn't understand," Lena continued, her voice growing stronger. "Your judgment had nothing to do with us and everything to do with you. We didn't fail because we left. We succeeded because we stopped letting your opinions define our worth. And I came back here today not to prove you wrong, that's already been done, but to thank you." "Thank us?" Mrs. Pemberton's fan stopped entirely. "Thank you for being so unkind that leaving became the only option. Thank you for making staying here unbearable, because if you'd been even slightly more tolerable, we might have settled for misery instead of searching for joy. Thank you for teaching us that the only opinions that matter are the ones that come from people who actually know us and care about our well-being." Mary stepped forward, adding her own voice to the moment. "You taught us that just because someone's speaking doesn't mean they're saying anything worth hearing. That judgment from people who don't know struggle isn't judgment, it's just noise. And we're grateful for the lesson, even if the teaching was cruel." Caleb wrapped an arm around Lena's shoulders, his presence solid and sure. "We harbor no ill will toward Mineral Springs or anyone in it, but we also won't be coming back. We've built a life elsewhere, and that life is full enough that it doesn't have room for places that only ever made us feel empty." They turned to leave, and Lena felt the finality of it settling into her bones. This was closure. Not dramatic or vengeful, but simple and complete. They'd said what needed saying, and now they could walk away with nothing left hanging. "Wait." The voice came from an unexpected source, a young woman Lena vaguely recognized from church, someone who'd always hovered on the edges of the judgment circle without actively participating. "I'm glad you made it. Glad you're doing well. Some of us—" She glanced at the others, then back to Lena. "Some of us hoped you would. Not everyone here wanted you to fail." "Thank you," Lena said sincerely. "That means more than you know." They left Mineral Springs in the late afternoon, driving out with the same wagon that had brought them in, but carrying something different now. Not vindication exactly, though that had been sweet in its way, but completion. The story that had begun with eviction and desperation had reached its proper ending, and they could finally close the book on that chapter. "How do you feel?" Caleb asked as the town disappeared behind them. "Free," Lena answered, surprised by how true it was. "Like I've been carrying a weight I didn't realize was there, and now it's gone." They looked shocked, Mary observed from the wagon bed. Like they couldn't believe we'd actually succeeded. People often can't believe what they've already decided is impossible, Caleb said. That's their limitation, not ours. The journey back to the valley felt shorter somehow, as if the land itself was pulling them home. They arrived late this following evening to find Grace and Ruth waiting on the porch, lamplight spilling from the cabin windows in warm welcome. "How was it?" Grace asked as they climbed down from the wagon. "Exactly what we needed it to be," Lena answered, pulling both girls into a hug. "And now it's over. Really, truly over." Summer ripened into autumn, and with the changing season came the first tangible manifestation of their expanding plans. Caleb used accumulated payments from Patterson to purchase breeding cattle from a rancher 2 territories over, 6 heifers and a bull, all quality stock with documented lineage. They arrived in early October, driven by the seller himself, who wanted to see where his animals would be living. "Fine setup you've got here," he commented, surveying the valley with an experienced eye. "Good water, protected grazing, plenty of space. These cattle should do well for you." "That's the plan," Caleb agreed. "Start small, build quality, expand only when we're ready." The rancher nodded approval. "Smart approach. Too many folks try to grow too fast and end up with more problems than profit. You take care of these animals, they'll build you a legacy." After he left, they stood together watching the cattle explore their new home, the animals moving through the grass with the cautious curiosity of creatures adjusting to unfamiliar territory. "This is really happening," Mary said, wonder in her voice. "We're really building a ranch." "We really are," Lena confirmed. "Your grandfather left us land and shelter. We're turning it into something that will last generations." As autumn deepened, they threw themselves into preparation with the focused intensity of people who knew exactly what they were working toward. A proper barn rose beside the cabin, large enough to shelter the cattle during harsh weather and store the equipment they'd been accumulating. Fences went up marking pasture boundaries, built strong enough to contain livestock but flexible enough to be reconfigured as needs changed. Grace surprised them all by declaring she wanted to learn animal husbandry, reading every book on cattle breeding she could get her hands on, and taking meticulous notes on each animal's characteristics and health. She created a ledger tracking bloodlines, birth weights, growth rates, information that would prove invaluable as they expanded the herd. Ruth appointed herself the cattle's personal guardian, naming each one and visiting them daily with treats and conversation. The animals, responding to her gentle attention, became notably calmer and more manageable than most range cattle. "She has a gift," Caleb observed one evening, watching Ruth sing to the bull while brushing his coat. "Animals trust her in ways they don't trust most people." "She trusts them back," Lena said, "and trust recognized is trust returned." The second payment from Patterson arrived larger than the first, $78, reflecting increased extraction as the operation found its rhythm. The third payment, delivered in November, topped $90. By the end of their first full year in the valley, they'd accumulated more money than Caleb had earned in the previous 5 years combined. "We need to think about security," Mary said one evening, eyeing the growing cash reserves they kept hidden in the cabin. "This much money sitting here makes us vulnerable." "We could open an account in Silver City," Caleb suggested. "Bank it properly instead of hiding it in mattresses and jars." "Banks can fail," Grace countered, her reading having taught her about economic instability. "Maybe we diversify. Some in the bank, some invested in livestock and equipment, some kept here for emergencies." They settled on Grace's suggestion, splitting their reserves across multiple forms. Some went into the Silver City Bank, earning modest interest. Some purchased additional cattle and better equipment, and some stayed hidden in the cabin, insurance against disasters that required immediate cash. Winter arrived gently that year, more snow but less bitter cold than the previous season. The cabin, improved and expanded over the summer, stayed warm with less effort. The barn sheltered the cattle comfortably, and the food stores, even more abundant than before, promised easy passage through the frozen months. It was during this second winter that Caleb found his father's journal again, tucked away in the trunk where he'd first discovered it. He read through it slowly one evening while the family gathered around the fireplace, and when he finished, he looked up with tears in his eyes. "Listen to this," he said, his voice rough. "It's the last entry, dated 2 weeks before he died. If my son ever finds this place, I hope it serves him as it served me, not as an escape from hardship, but as a foundation for building something better. I came here broken by war and found peace. I came here poor and found wealth that had nothing to do with silver. I came here alone and felt the presence of something larger than myself. Whatever he finds when he arrives, I hope he understands that the true value of this valley isn't in what it contains, but in what it allows a person to become. The words settled over them like benediction. Lena reached for Caleb's hand, and he took it gratefully. He was right, Caleb said. The silver matters, the land matters, but what really changed was us. We became people who could stand up for ourselves, who could negotiate instead of just accepting, who could build instead of just surviving. We became people who deserve what we have, Mary added, because we worked for it, fought for it, earned it honestly. Christmas that year was celebrated with the abundance that still felt slightly unreal. Real gifts purchased with real money, books for Grace, tools for Mary, a beautiful doll for Ruth. Caleb gave Lena a shawl he'd commissioned from a weaver in Silver City, soft wool dyed deep blue. She gave him a pocket watch, practical and precious, engraved on the back with words she'd chosen carefully. Time well spent. Spring arrived like a promise kept, and with it came Patterson himself, riding into the valley with an expression Lena had learned to read as complicated business news. "The vein's playing out," he announced without preamble. "We've extracted most of the easily accessible silver. Going deeper would require equipment and investment that don't make economic sense." Lena's heart sank. They'd grown accustomed to the monthly payments, had built plans around their continuation. "How much longer?" Caleb asked. 3 months, maybe 4. After that, the operation shuts down. Patterson dismounted, looking around the valley with something like regret. "I wanted to tell you in person and to make an offer." "What kind of offer?" "I'll buy out your percentage interest for a lump sum, $500, paid immediately. It's fair value for what would have come over the next few months, and it gives you capital now instead of stretched over time." They discussed it that evening, weighing the security of guaranteed monthly payments against the opportunity of immediate capital. Grace ran calculations showing that $500 invested wisely could generate returns exceeding what they'd receive from the remaining ore extraction. Mary argued for taking the money and using it to expand the cattle operation. Ruth just wanted to know if it meant the noisy mining would stop. "I think we take it," Lena said finally. "The silver was never meant to be forever. Your father's journal made that clear. It's a start, not a destination. We use this payment to build something more sustainable." They accepted Patterson's offer, and the $500 arrived in the form of a bank draft that felt almost weightless despite its value. The mining operation wound down over the following weeks, equipment removed, the hillside slowly reclaiming itself as nature covered the scars of extraction. With the mining complete and the valley returning to quieter rhythms, they threw themselves into ranching with renewed focus. The original 6 heifers produced 5 healthy calves that spring, and Caleb purchased 3 more breeding cows to expand the herd. Grace's meticulous records proved invaluable, allowing them to track bloodlines and make informed breeding decisions. By summer, they'd established themselves as a ranch rather than just a homestead. Word spread through the ranching community about the Moore operation, small but producing quality stock, managed by people who knew what they were doing. They received visits from other ranchers interested in purchasing calves, and Lena found herself negotiating sales with the same firm confidence she'd shown in dealing with Patterson. It was during one of these visits that the rancher made an observation that stuck with Lena long after he'd left. "You folks have built something special here," he said, gesturing at the valley. "Not just a successful ranch, but a real legacy. Your girls are learning ranching from the ground up, getting education most boys never receive. That's wisdom that'll serve them their whole lives." After he left, Lena mentioned the comment to Caleb. "He's right, you know. We haven't just built a ranch. We've built a future for the girls that would have been impossible in Mineral Springs." "You think they'll stay?" Caleb asked. "When they're grown, when they have choices?" "I think they'll choose what's right for them, and we'll support whatever that is." Lena looked toward the barn where Mary was working with a new calf, patient and confident. "But I also think we've shown them that worth isn't determined by other people's opinions. That hard work and integrity build more than just wealth. They build character. Whatever they choose, they'll choose it from strength, not desperation. As summer progressed into another autumn, they received a letter forwarded from the Silver City post office. The return address was Mineral Springs, and Lena's stomach tightened when she recognized Mrs. Pemberton's handwriting. "Should we read it?" she asked Caleb. "Might as well. We've come too far to be hurt by words on paper." The letter was shorter than Lena expected, the usually elaborate handwriting cramped and uncertain. "Dear Mrs. Moore," it began, "I am writing to offer what I should have offered long ago, an apology. Your visit last year troubled me more than I admitted, and time has not eased that trouble. You were right about many things you said, and I have spent these months examining my own behavior with increasing discomfort. I was cruel when you needed kindness, judgmental when I should have been supportive, and dismissive when you deserved respect. I cannot undo those wrongs, but I can acknowledge them and ask forgiveness I likely do not deserve. I hope your family continues to prosper, and I hope you know that some of us learned from your courage, even if we learned too late to make amends while it mattered. Sincerely, Eleanor Pemberton." The silence after Lena finished reading was profound. She read it again, looking for the trap, the hidden barb, the way the apology might actually be an attack disguised as contrition. But it seemed genuine, as painful as it clearly had been to write. "What do we do?" Mary asked. "We forgive her," Lena said, surprising herself with the certainty. "Not because she deserves it, but because we don't need to carry anger anymore. Forgiveness isn't for her benefit, it's for ours." They composed a brief response together, acknowledging the apology and wishing Mrs. Pemberton well, without reopening communication or suggesting future contact. When it was sent, Lena felt another piece of the past settle into place, completed and released. That winter passed easily, made comfortable by accumulated resources and established routines. The cattle thrived, the girls grew, and the valley continued to provide exactly what they needed when they needed it. Spring arrived with news that one of their cows had produced twin calves, rare enough to be remarkable and valuable enough to generate excitement through the ranching community. "We're making a name for ourselves," Caleb observed, reading a letter from a rancher 3 territories away asking about purchasing breeding stock. "Moore Valley Ranch is becoming known for quality." "Moore Valley Ranch," Lena repeated, testing the name. "When did we start calling it that?" Grace started it in her ledgers. Seemed to fit, so it stuck. He smiled at her. "You object?" "Not at all. I like it. It's ours, properly and completely." 2 years after arriving in the valley, they received another unexpected visitor, Gideon Walsh, the old man whose betrayal had led to Patterson's arrival. He rode in slowly, hands visible and empty, his expression carrying the weight of guilt and hope in equal measure. "I don't expect welcome," he said from horseback, not dismounting without permission. "But I wanted to say my piece before age or conscience kills me." "Say it," Caleb responded, his voice neutral. "I was wrong to tell Patterson about the silver, wrong to take your hospitality and repay it with betrayal. I was broke and desperate, and he offered me money for information about promising claims. I convinced myself it didn't matter, that you'd manage somehow." He paused, and his voice roughened. "But it did matter. I've carried the weight of that choice for 2 years, and it's gotten heavier with each passing day." "You could have cost us everything," Mary said, her voice hard. "Your information nearly destroyed what we'd built. I know, and I can't undo it, but I can offer what compensation I have." He pulled a pouch from his coat, tossing it to Caleb. $300. Everything I got from Patterson, plus what I've managed to save since. It won't make us even, but it's all I have to offer besides words." Caleb opened the pouch, counting the money quickly. When he looked up, his expression was unreadable. "You hurt us," he said, "but you also taught us something valuable, that we could fight for what was ours and win. Patterson forced us to negotiate from strength instead of accepting whatever we were offered. In a strange way, your betrayal made us stronger." "That doesn't excuse it," Gideon said. "No, it doesn't. But it does complicate it." Caleb looked at Lena, and she nodded slightly. "We'll accept your money, not as payment for what you took, but as recognition that you understand you were wrong, and then we'll part ways with no debt between us, good or bad." Relief flooded the old man's face. That's more grace than I deserve. Probably, Lena agreed. But we've learned that sometimes giving more grace than someone deserves is how you free yourself from the weight of their mistakes. Gideon left shortly after, riding out with visible relief. They stood watching him go, the $300 heavy in Caleb's hands. We could have turned him away, Mary observed. We could have, Lena agreed. But what would that have served? He acknowledged his wrong, offered what compensation he could, and asked for forgiveness. Refusing that would have made us smaller, not him. That evening, they discussed what to do with Gideon's money. Grace suggested setting it aside for the girls' futures, a fund for education or dowries or whatever opportunities arose. Mary wanted to invest it in the ranch, expanding operations further. Ruth thought they should use it for something frivolous, since it was unexpected money. They compromised, splitting it 3 ways, 1 part for each girl's future fund, 1 part for ranch expansion, and 1 part for something none of them needed but all of them wanted. A proper piano, shipped from Silver City and installed in the cabin's main room. When it arrived 6 weeks later, delivered by freight wagon and installed with elaborate care, Lena stood before it with tears in her eyes. She'd learned to play as a girl, before circumstances had whittled her life down to necessities. The ability had seemed irrelevant for so long, a skill from another lifetime. But now, running her fingers over the keys, hearing music fill the cabin, she felt something complete itself. They'd moved beyond survival into the realm of beauty, beyond necessity into the space of joy. Grace took to the piano with natural talent, learning quickly and practicing daily. Ruth sang while her sister played, her clear voice soaring through melodies. And Mary, who claimed no musical ability, nonetheless sat listening with evident pleasure, her usual restlessness quieted by harmony. 3 years after arriving in the valley, on a morning when summer heat pressed down but didn't oppress, Lena stood on the cabin porch surveying everything they'd built. The barn stood solid and weathered, already looking like it had been there forever. The cattle grazed in the pasture, their numbers grown to 23 head of quality stock. The garden flourished under Grace's careful attention, and the girls, her girls now in every way that mattered, worked with competence and confidence that would have seemed impossible during those desperate Mineral Springs days. Caleb joined her, slipping an arm around her waist. What are you thinking about? About how far we've come. About that eviction notice you burned 3 years ago. About the town that thought we'd fail. She leaned into his warmth. About how glad I am that we were desperate enough to try something impossible. You think we would have looked for this place if things hadn't gotten so bad? No, she admitted. We would have kept trying to make Mineral Springs work, kept accepting less than we deserved because it seemed safer than risking everything on a chance. Sometimes desperation is a gift. A painful gift. The best ones usually are. She turned to face him fully. Caleb, are you happy? Really, truly happy? He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, his eyes moving across the valley before returning to her face. I'm more than happy. I'm at peace. I wake up knowing I'm enough. Not perfect, not without struggles, but enough. That's something I never felt in town, no matter how hard I worked or how much I tried. Here, I'm just enough. We're enough, Lena corrected. All of us together. We're exactly enough. That afternoon, they gathered the girls for a family meeting, something they did periodically to discuss plans and make collective decisions. This time, Caleb had a specific proposal. We've been talking about this for months, he began, glancing at Lena for support. And we think it's time to make it official. Moore Valley Ranch is profitable enough to sustain us, and the cattle operation is established enough to continue growing. We think it's time to start teaching you girls not just ranching skills, but business management. You mean giving us responsibility for actual decisions? Mary's eyes lit with interest. We mean making you partners, Lena clarified. Each of you will manage an aspect of the operation. Mary, you're already handling most of the physical labor and equipment maintenance. That becomes your official responsibility, with authority to make decisions about purchases and repairs. Grace, you've been keeping the books and bloodline records. That becomes your domain. Finances, breeding programs, sales negotiations. And Ruth, I'm too young for real responsibility, Ruth interrupted, her voice matter of fact. You're old enough to manage the chickens, the garden, and food preservation, Caleb countered. That's not small work, Ruth. That's what keeps us fed and healthy. And as you get older, your responsibilities will grow with you. They spent the rest of the afternoon discussing the implications, assigning specific duties, and establishing protocols for major decisions that would require family consensus. By evening, they'd transformed from a family running a ranch to a family partnership managing an enterprise. This is real, Grace said wonderingly. We're not just helping, we're actually running this together. That was always the goal, Lena told her. Your grandfather left this place for desperate times, but we're turning it into a legacy. And legacies are built by generations, not individuals. As autumn arrived for the fourth time since they descended into the valley, Lena found herself reflecting on the journey with a clarity that only time and distance could provide. They'd arrived as refugees running from judgment and failure. They'd stayed as survivors, learning to work the land and protect what they'd found. They'd fought as warriors, defending their rights against those who would have taken without asking. And now they were settled as builders, creating something that would outlast them. The final payment from Patterson's mining operation had arrived years ago. The hillside had healed over, and the silver that had once seemed so important now felt like a footnote rather than the main story.
The real wealth had never been underground. It had always been in the soil, the water, the valley itself,
And in their willingness to work for what they wanted rather than accepting what others offered. Winter that year brought news from Mineral Springs, carried by a traveling merchant who'd heard the Moore family had connections there. The town had fallen on harder times, he reported. The drought had returned, worse than before. Several businesses had closed. People were leaving for better opportunities elsewhere. Do you feel sorry for them? Mary asked when the merchant had gone. Lena considered. I feel sorry for the ones who deserved better. The young woman who wished us well when we left. Maybe others who didn't participate in the judgment but didn't stop it either. But mostly I feel distant. Like that was a story that happened to different people, and we just happened to remember it. It was a different version of us, Grace observed. We're not those people anymore.
No, Lena agreed. We're not.
Spring arrived with a surprise, a letter from a university in the Eastern Territories responding to an inquiry Grace had made months earlier. They were willing to accept her for advanced studies in agriculture and animal husbandry, fully aware she was female and willing to accommodate her gender in ways most institutions wouldn't. Grace held the letter with shaking hands, reading it aloud 3 times before the words seemed real. I'd have to leave, she said, the statement carrying both excitement and fear, for at least 2 years. Maybe longer. Then you leave, Lena said, her heart breaking and swelling simultaneously. You go learn everything they can teach you, and then you come back and make this ranch even better. Or you don't come back and you build something amazing somewhere else. Either way, you go. But the ranch will be fine, Caleb assured her. Mary and Ruth and Mama Lena and I will manage. And when you come back, you'll have knowledge that makes us stronger. That's worth temporary separation. They discussed it through the evening, working through logistics and fears and possibilities. Grace would leave in the autumn, giving them time to adjust operations and prepare for her absence. Mary would take over the financial record-keeping, her practical mind quickly grasping the systems Grace had created, and they would all learn to manage without the girl whose quiet wisdom had guided so many decisions. Summer passed in a blur of preparation and emotional adjustment. Grace trained Mary on the books, documented all the ranching protocols she'd developed, and wrote detailed instructions for continuing her breeding programs. The family held her close while also beginning the process of letting go, understanding that love sometimes meant releasing rather than holding. On a morning in late September, they loaded Grace onto the stage that would begin her journey east. She was 17, tall and serious and terrified in equal measure. The entire family came to Silver City to see her off, standing together as she boarded with her trunk of carefully packed belongings. Don't forget us, Ruth said through tears. Impossible, Grace assured her. You're all coming with me, in here. She touched her heart. Every lesson, every value, every story we've shared, I'm taking all of it. She hugged them each in turn, Ruth clinging, Mary stoic but red-eyed, Caleb gruff with suppressed emotion, and finally Lena. Thank you, Grace whispered against her shoulder, for choosing us, for choosing Papa, for showing me that women can be strong and soft at the same time. You showed yourself that, Lena corrected, her own tears falling freely. I just got to watch. The stage pulled away and they stood watching until it disappeared from view. Then they climbed into their wagon and headed back to the valley, quieter than they'd come, carrying absence like a weight they'd learned to bear. Life adjusted to Grace's absence gradually. Letters arrived regularly, full of details about her studies and observations about eastern cities that seemed impossibly foreign to valley-raised eyes. She was thriving, her professors impressed by her practical knowledge and quick mind. She'd made friends, joined study groups, and was beginning to consider possibilities beyond ranching. She might not come back, Mary observed one evening, reading her sister's latest letter. Not to stay, anyway. Would that be wrong? Lena asked. No, Mary admitted. It would be her choice, and we said we'd support that. But I'll miss her. We all will. But missing someone doesn't mean we begrudge them their happiness. Sometimes love means celebrating their journey, even when it takes them away from us. Winter arrived, and with it came reflection on 5 years of valley life. They'd transformed from desperate refugees to established ranchers. The cattle herd numbered 37 head, all quality stock that commanded premium prices. The ranch was profitable, sustainable, and growing, and the family, while smaller with Grace gone, remained strong in their bonds and clear in their purpose. It was during this winter that Caleb found Lana in the cabin one evening, staring at the piano without playing, lost in thought. "What is it?" he asked, settling beside her. "I was thinking about the woman I was 5 years ago, standing in that cottage in Mineral Springs, counting coins and absorbing judgment. She feels like a stranger now, someone I knew once but barely recognize. You're not her anymore." "No, I'm not, but I'm grateful to her." Lena's fingers found the piano keys, playing softly. She was strong enough to leave, brave enough to try, stubborn enough to fight. Without her choices, we wouldn't be here. "Without our choices together," Caleb corrected. "You didn't do this alone, and neither did I. We built this life as partners." "We did," she agreed. "And it's a good life, Caleb. Better than I imagined possible back when we were desperate and scared." "Better than I deserved," he said quietly. "Better than we thought we deserved," Lena corrected. "But exactly what we earned through work and determination and refusing to give up even when giving up seemed easier." They sat together in comfortable silence, the piano notes fading into the quiet of the valley night. Outside, snow fell softly, adding to the already substantial accumulation. The cattle were sheltered and fed. The cabin was warm, and inside these walls, they'd created not just a home, but a sanctuary where worth was measured by character rather than circumstances, where failure was reframed as redirection, and where the only judgment that mattered was the one they passed on themselves. Spring arrived with Grace's announcement that she'd be coming home for the summer, bringing a friend who wanted to see Western ranching operations. Summer brought her return, along with a young woman from Philadelphia who looked at the valley with the same wonder they'd felt on first arrival. "It's beautiful," Grace's friend breathed, "like something from a story." "It is a story," Ruth said, now 9 and confident in her valley knowledge. "Our story. And it's still being written." They spent that summer showing Grace's friend the ranch operations, teaching her to ride, explaining breeding programs and grazing rotation. She absorbed it all with enthusiasm, and when she left in August, she carried pamphlets about agricultural programs and dreams about returning west. "You're inspiring people," Lena told Grace as they watched her friend's departure, "showing them what's possible." "You inspired me first," Grace countered. "Everything I'm doing, I learned by watching you and Papa refuse to accept limitations." Grace returned to her studies in the autumn, but the summer visit had reestablished connection and confirmed that distance didn't diminish belonging. She was building her own life while remaining rooted in the valley that had shaped her, and that balance felt exactly right. 6 years after arriving in the valley, on an anniversary they'd taken to celebrating quietly, Lena and Caleb stood at the spot where they'd first looked down from the ridge. The valley spread below them, transformed by their labor, but still recognizable as the salvation that had appeared when they needed it most. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't found this place?" Caleb asked. "Sometimes," Lena admitted, "but I don't dwell on it. Alternative histories don't help us appreciate what we have. What we built," he corrected. What we built, she agreed. They descended into the valley together, walking the path that had become as familiar as breathing. Mary was working with a new calf near the barn. Ruth was in the garden, singing to the plants in the belief that it helped them grow. And the cabin waited, solid and welcoming, smoke rising from the chimney into the clear summer air. That evening, as they gathered for supper, just the four of them now, with Grace's absence an acknowledged but accepted reality, Lena looked around the table and felt completion. Not the completion of ending, but the completion of becoming. They'd arrived as people running from judgment. They'd become people worthy of the grace they'd found. I have an announcement, Mary said, setting down her fork with unusual formality. I've been offered a position as assistant foreman at the Garrison Ranch, 3 days ride south. It's good pay, excellent experience, and a chance to learn large-scale operations. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Mary, like Grace before her, was ready to spread wings the valley had helped her grow. Are you taking it? Lena asked, keeping her voice neutral. I want to, for a year, maybe 2. Learn what they can teach me, then come back and apply it here, if that's all right with you. It's more than all right, Caleb said, pride evident in his voice. It's exactly what you should do. We raised you to be capable, not dependent. Time to show the world what you can do. Mary left 6 weeks later, riding out with the same determination that characterized everything she did. The family stood together watching her go, and Ruth cried despite her sister's promise to visit regularly. Everyone's leaving, she said between sobs. Everyone's growing, Lena corrected gently. And growth sometimes means going away to learn and experience, then coming back stronger. You'll do the same someday. I won't, Ruth declared with the absolute certainty of a 9-year-old. I'm staying here forever. Lena smiled but didn't argue. Time would reveal Ruth's path, just as it had revealed her sister's. For now, she could believe in forever. The ranch continued, adjusted to smaller hands, but no less productive. Caleb and Lena worked harder to cover Mary's absence, and Ruth stepped up in ways that surprised them both, taking on responsibilities beyond her years with cheerful competence. Letters arrived from both girls regularly. Grace was excelling in her studies and considering doctoral work. Mary was learning large-scale ranching and impressing her employers with innovation and work ethic. Both were thriving in their separate paths, and both made clear they considered the valley home regardless of where they currently lived. 7 years after arriving in the valley, Lena woke one morning to find silver in her hair that hadn't been there the night before, or at least that she hadn't noticed. She stood before the mirror studying this evidence of passing time, neither pleased nor distressed, simply acknowledging. You're beautiful, Caleb said from behind her. I'm aging. Same thing. He wrapped arms around her waist. Every year you've lived, every challenge you've faced, every decision you've made. They're all written in those silver strands. And they're beautiful because they represent a life well lived. She leaned back against him, studying their reflection. They'd both changed over the years, weathered by sun and work, marked by time and circumstance. But the changes felt earned rather than inflicted, evidence of living rather than merely surviving. We did it, she said softly. Everything we hoped for when we drove into this valley, desperate and scared, we actually did it. We did more than that, Caleb corrected. We built something worth passing on. Legacy isn't just land and cattle. It's the example we set, the values we lived, the proof that people can rise above their circumstances if they're willing to work and fight and believe in something better. That evening, sitting on the porch while Ruth practiced piano inside, her talent surpassing even Grace's, Lena thought about the journey that had brought them here. An eviction notice that had seemed like ending, a dead man's directions that had seemed like desperate fantasy, a valley that had seemed too perfect to be real. But it had all been real. The desperation, the discovery, the determination, the success. All of it, from the first desperate climb over the ridge to this peaceful evening 7 years later, had been achingly, beautifully real. Summer deepened, and with it came news that made them all pause. Mineral Springs, struggling for years, had finally been abandoned entirely. The remaining residents had scattered to other towns, the buildings stood empty, and the place that had once seemed so important to their lives had simply ceased to exist. It's gone, Ruth said wonderingly, reading the newspaper report. The whole town, just gone. Not gone, Lena corrected. Changed. The people are somewhere else, building new lives, just like we did. But we came here. Where did they go? Wherever they needed to go to find their own valleys. Lena looked out at the land that had saved them. Everyone has to find their own salvation. Ours happened to be here. On a morning in late summer, 8 years after their arrival, Lena stood in the exact spot where they'd first built a cooking fire, where they'd eaten fish from the river and planned their survival. The cabin had expanded over the years, a second room added for Ruth's growing need for privacy. The barn had been rebuilt twice, each iteration larger and more sophisticated, and the land bore the marks of their habitation in ways both visible and subtle. But the valley itself remained essentially unchanged. The river still ran clear and cold. The hills still provided protection from harsh weather. The soil still grew things with generous abundance. The place that had saved them continued its quiet work of preservation and provision, asking nothing in return except respect and care. Caleb found her there, as he often did when she needed to think. "Regrets?" he asked. "Not one," she answered honestly. "You?" "Only that I didn't find this place sooner, but then maybe we weren't ready sooner. Maybe we needed the desperation to appreciate what we found." "Maybe desperation is just another word for readiness," Lena mused. "Maybe we were exactly where we needed to be, exactly when we needed to be there." They stood together in comfortable silence, two people who'd survived judgment and poverty and fear to build something that mattered. The girls were gone for now, but coming back, drawn by ties stronger than distance. The ranch thrived under their care, and the valley continued its ancient work of sheltering those wise enough to accept its help. That evening, as they prepared for bed, Ruth asked a question that had clearly been building. "Mama Lena, Papa, do you think we'll always live here, even when I'm grown and Grace and Mary come back?" "I think," Lena said carefully, "that this valley will always be home, whether we're living in it or just carrying it in our hearts. Some places claim you, and you carry them forever." "The valley claimed us," Ruth said with certainty. "I can feel it, like it chose us." "Or we chose each other," Caleb suggested. "Choice goes both ways." Later, lying in the darkness with Caleb's breathing steady beside her, Lena thought about all the choices that had led them here. Choosing to marry a man the town deemed unsuitable. Choosing to leave when staying became untenable. Choosing to follow directions to a place that might not exist. Choosing to fight for what they'd found. Choosing to build rather than simply occupy. Every choice had mattered. Every decision had contributed to the life they'd created. And looking back, she wouldn't change any of them, because changing one would mean changing all of them, and the destination was too precious to risk. The valley slept around them, holding them safe in the darkness. And Lena slept too, dreamlessly and deeply, the sleep of someone who'd found exactly where they belonged and had the wisdom to recognize the gift. In the morning, there would be work. There was always work. Cattle to tend, equipment to maintain, a ranch to run. But there would also be piano music drifting from the cabin, Ruth's clear voice singing songs she'd learned from her sisters. There would be letters from Grace and Mary, connecting them across distance. And there would be the quiet satisfaction of knowing they'd taken desperate circumstances and transformed them into dignity, taken judgment and transformed it into independence, taken fear and transformed it into foundation. They'd arrived in the valley with nothing but determination and each other. They'd built an empire of belonging, a kingdom of quiet worth, a legacy measured not in silver or cattle, but in the evidence that people could change their own stories if they were brave enough to try. The eviction notice that had started it all was ash scattered in some forgotten fire. The town that had judged them was abandoned and silent. But the valley remained, eternal and patient, continuing its work of saving those wise enough to accept salvation. And the Moore family, built from second chances and stubborn love, continued too, growing, changing, adapting, but always rooted in the moment when desperation had driven them to risk everything on an impossible hope that turned out to be exactly what they needed all along.